Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the longest, messiest, and weirdest breakups in history. Picture this: an island, smaller than Madagascar, somehow ends up bossing around a subcontinent, bursting with palaces, poetry, pepper, and 5,000 years of its own ideas. You already know this isn't going to end cleanly. It starts with innocent trade, some nutmeg here, a bolt of silk there, then suddenly it's cannonballs, tax collectors, and bureaucrats who can't pronounce Hyderabad. Before long, Britain is running India like a mismanaged startup, complete with unpaid interns, dodgy spreadsheets, and famine on the balance sheet. And through it all, resistance, rebellion about the rebellion. And yes, one very quiet man with round glasses who manages to upend an empire just by walking to the beach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It started, as these things so often do, with hunger. Not the tragic, stomach-clutching kind, at least not yet, but the craving of Europe's merchants for things their cold climates couldn't grow. Spices, silks, precious gems, and dyes that made their woolens look less like potato sacks. The Italians and Portuguese had gotten there first, but the English, they were late to the party and had no real invitation. They did, however, bring ships and ambition, and a willingness to do business with absolutely anyone, morals not included. In 1600, the English East India Company was born, essentially a corporate startup with a royal permission slip. Imagine a business so powerful it could print its own money, sign its own treaties, and in time, topple actual governments. Not bad for a bunch of wool traders. They weren't the only ones sniffing around India's riches. The Dutch and French had their own companies, and for decades, everyone played a game of awkward diplomacy and subtle theft, each building trading posts and trying to avoid all-out war. Meanwhile, India was not some sitting duck waiting to be colonized. It was an enormous, diverse, thriving land of empires, city-states, and kingdoms. The Mughal Empire, in particular, was still formidable, boasting glittering courts, sophisticated administration, and an economy that at one point accounted for nearly a quarter of global GDP. Yes, you heard that right. A quarter. That's how rich India was. Early British contact wasn't imperial at all. They came politely asking for permission to trade, bowing deeply to emperors, and offering clockwork toys and woolen stockings as gifts. The Mughals, for their part, were mildly amused. These odd Europeans in tights with strange accents and absolutely no idea how to behave at court, but they allowed trade. Why not? The British were just another merchant group, no different from Persians, Armenians, or the Portuguese. One of the earliest posts was in Surat, a busy western port where ships jostled for space, and markets echoed with 10 languages. The British built warehouses, called factories, not because they made anything but because they were run by factors, or agents. These factories were supposed to be temporary, but over time, they started looking more like castles. Thick walls, guard towers, a few cannons for protection, of course. This gradual militarization didn't go unnoticed. But the British were clever. They didn't confront Indian power head-on. They wormed into the cracks, they paid bribes when needed, they flattered the right officials, and they learned very early on that Indian politics was complicated and ripe for the kind of manipulation you'd expect from a corporate boardroom, not a battlefield. Meanwhile, back home, things were shifting. England was no longer a sleepy island. The Industrial Revolution was stirring. The demand for raw materials and markets to sell finished goods was ballooning. India, with its massive population and fertile lands, looked less like a trading partner and more like a prize. A warehouse to raid, a people to tax, an empire just waiting for an owner. But there was a catch. Britain didn't have the manpower to conquer India in one swoop. What they did have was patience, and paperwork, and an army of accountants who realized something interesting. They didn't need to rule India to drain its wealth. They just needed to control the trade, skim off the profits, and make themselves indispensable in every dispute between local rulers. One of the strangest early episodes involved Thomas Roe, a British ambassador sent to the Mughal court in 1615. He arrived in Agra with gifts, pomp, and enough awkwardness to make everyone uncomfortable. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir received him politely but never took him very seriously. Roe spent years begging for trade privileges, often writing frustrated letters home about how Indians refused to be impressed by England's greatness. Imagine showing someone your best gadget and being met with a polite yawn and a better gadget. But Roe's mission wasn't a total failure. It set the stage for deeper engagement. The company learned. It adapted. It started playing Indian politics like a sitar, plucking the right strings, backing the right factions, and always staying close to money. Historians still argue whether the British had any grand imperial plan at this stage. Some say yes, empire was always the goal. Others argue it was pure chaos, one decision leading to another, until suddenly they were in charge of half a continent. The truth is probably both. The company was greedy, not visionary, but in chasing gold, it accidentally swallowed a civilization. And gold there was. So much gold, and silver, and diamonds. Europeans wrote home about Indian markets overflowing with finery. Embroidered textiles, carved ivory, jewelry that made royal crowns look basic. There's a reason Britain's later industrial growth was fueled by Indian capital. They didn't build it all themselves. They just redirected the flow. But India wasn't passive in all this. Indian merchants thrived too. They dealt with Europeans shrewdly, often playing one against the other. Indian rulers made strategic alliances, used company troops to fight local wars, and extracted their own benefits. It wasn't a simple story of conquest. It was a complicated dance of opportunity, betrayal, and short-term thinking, with long-term consequences. Still, the writing was on the wall. British trading posts were becoming power centers. Their influence grew, not through armies, but through ledgers, through debt, through diplomacy, through deals so complex and boring on paper that no one noticed they were quietly gutting India's autonomy. So next time someone mentions the British bringing civilization to India, just remember, the British came for pepper and left with palaces, and they didn't do it by accident. British ships started appearing off India's coast, like curious but over-armed tourists. They came bobbing across the Arabian Sea, their sails patched and stained, their crews pale and already complaining about the heat. But tucked in their holds wasn't just wool or silver, it was ambition, and not the quiet, slow-burning kind. This was the sort that packed cannons just in case negotiations got confusing. By the mid-1600s, the English East India Company had earned the right to set up more coastal outposts, including Madras on the east coast and Bombay, which they actually received as part of a Portuguese princess's dowry. Yes, that's how casually European royalty treated chunks of India as wedding presents. Bombay, later Mumbai, was a string of swamps and islands at the time, but the British had plans. Big ones. The plan was simple: smile, trade, and slowly plant your flag in the sand. Trade stations became factories, and then forts. Forts meant soldiers. Soldiers meant taxes, and taxes meant control. At first, these forts were small, scrappy things, more wooden fence than mighty castle. But over time, they bulked up with stone walls, watchtowers and cannons that pointed outwards, and sometimes inwards, depending on the mood of the locals. There was an awkward charm to it all. In Madras, Fort St. George began as a little British bubble, surrounded by a city that mostly ignored it. The British had their own churches, rules, and dinner parties. They wore wool in the tropics, drank gin like it was water, and complained about the mosquitoes while merrily ignoring 4,000 years of local knowledge. The heat, they insisted, was worse than the Caribbean. It wasn't, but they couldn't admit the Caribbean was easier. They brought trade goods, shore cloth, metals, firearms. But India already had everything it needed. So what did the British offer? Protection. From what exactly? Well, from the Portuguese, the Dutch, or if need be, themselves. It was a kind of reverse protection racket. We'll build a fort to keep others out, and you in. Indian rulers, especially smaller ones, found this weirdly useful. The subcontinent wasn't a single kingdom, It was a chessboard of sultanates, rajas and nawabs, all of them jockeying for power, and all of them willing to make a deal with the devil if it meant a slight edge. The British, they were just another tool, temporarily useful, or so it seemed. Inside these forts, company officials played both merchant and magistrate. They handed out contracts, settled local disputes, and held little courtrooms where they presided in wigs over cases involving goats, stolen spices, and unpaid loans. It was a kind of colonial cosplay at first, but they took it very seriously. And the paperwork? Mountainous. The British could bury any rebellion under 1,000 forms in triplicate. Historians still argue whether this early presence was meant to be permanent. Some say it was all about trade, no imperial dreams yet. Others point to the growing military presence and the company's private armies, trained in European drill styles, but paid in rupees, as signs that they knew what they were doing. The company may have started as a business, but it was fast becoming a state, with uniforms, and musket, and very sharp pens. Meanwhile, Indian merchants continued thriving. Local trade didn't stop because Europeans showed up. If anything, it got lovelier. Indian weavers were in high demand, especially for calico and muslin cloths, so finely spun they were described as woven air. British women back home swooned over these imports, and tailors in London scrambled to meet demand. The company made fortunes simply acting as the middleman. But money changes everything. As company profits grew, so did its appetite. It began to interfere in local politics more openly, supporting certain rulers, toppling others, and demanding more land around its forts for security. They called these areas settlements, though that word does a lot of heavy lifting for what were essentially proto-colonies. The locals noticed. Tensions flared. In 1686, the company made its first major blunder. Flush with arrogance and a few too many victories, it declared war on the Mughal Empire. Yes, an upstart British company declared war on one of the largest, richest empires on earth. Unsurprisingly, it went badly. Mughal forces seized British outposts, arrested company men, and politely informed them that they were very small fish in a very large pond. But here's the twist. Instead of being expelled forever, the company groveled, sent envoys, paid hefty bribes, and was allowed to stay. Why? Because the Mughals still saw them as useful, a minor irritant. Yes, but not worth squashing entirely. The British were good at bringing in silver after all. They paid well, and they still weren't considered a threat. That miscalculation would echo for centuries. It was around this time that the company began to build its private army in earnest. Originally meant to protect warehouses from bandits and rival traders, these troops slowly became a standing force. By the 1700s, the East India Company fielded tens of thousands of soldiers, many of them Indian, known as sepoys, trained in European tactics, but often serving under officers who couldn't speak a word of their language. A communication strategy best described as hope they guess correctly. Quirky detail: time. British forts began hosting cricket matches. Yes, cricket, on dusty parade grounds, in full sun, with enough sweating and fainting to make it a kind of endurance sport. Indian servants watched from the sidelines, bemused. No one knew yet that this strange game would one day become India's national obsession. But here it was, sweaty men in white flannels, shouting about wickets under the tropical sun. By now, the company had developed a personality, part merchant, part bureaucrat, part pirate, ironsed and dined Indian elites, whispered in royal ears, and quietly drained cities of their wealth. And its forts, they were no longer temporary structures, they were power bases. From Fort George in Madras to Fort William in Calcutta. These were imperial footholds, anchors for something bigger. Locals could sense the shift. The British were no longer just guests. They were staying, settling, building families, marrying, or at least mingling with locals. Some even adopted Indian customs, clothing and food. This cultural blending was messier than any romance novel. But for a moment it was real. The lines were blurred. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. India was changing. The British were no longer simply traders. They were landlords, taxmen, and soldiers. Their forts weren't outposts. They were foundations. And Britain, it still hadn't fully realized what it had started. The Mughal court was one of the grandest spectacles on earth. Domes gilded in gold, courtiers in silks, brighter than the peacocks strutting the gardens, and a bureaucracy so elaborate it made the British civil service look like a village bake sale. Into this world of scented air and sword-polished etiquette waddled the British. Awkward, overdressed, and entirely out of their depth. They came bearing gifts, clockwork parrots, cheap woolen coats, and the unshakable conviction that the crown was somehow impressive. The Mughals smiled politely. Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. They entertained the British with amused detachment, the way you might humor someone earnestly trying to impress you with a singing fish toy. India, after all, was the jewel. The British, a minor sideshow. But British charm came with fine print. They weren't just here to trade, they were here to stay. And they didn't need the Mughals to know that. The East India Company learned to speak the local languages, not out of respect but necessity. They hired Indian scribes, translators, and mercenaries. They began marrying local women, though marriage was often more legal fiction than social integration. A new Anglo-Indian class emerged, caught between two worlds, fluent in both, accepted by neither. This hybrid culture bloomed for a time, producing children, poetry, and scandal. Then it was crushed by racism, as the British elite hardened their lines and decided tea must always be served on a silver tray by someone else. Inside the Mughal palaces, however, change was brewing. The empire was fraying at the edges. Aurangzeb, the last truly powerful Mughal emperor, had stretched the realm too far, pouring resources into southern campaigns that drained the treasury. After his death in 1707, everything started to unravel. The imperial court, once a tightly run spectacle of control and incense, became a theater of confusion. This was the moment the company had been waiting for, though it didn't know it yet. With Mughal power splintering, provincial governors, Nawabs, began behaving like kings. They minted their own coins, raised armies, and passed laws as if Delhi no longer mattered. The British saw opportunity. These Nawabs needed money, soldiers, and friends in high, or at least foreign places. And the company was ready to provide all three, for a price. That price was usually land, or trade rights, or tax collection privileges. Once granted, the British rarely gave them back. In Bengal, the richest province of all, the situation reached peak absurdity. The British had been granted trading privileges by the local Nawab, but they were abusing them spectacularly, avoiding taxes, sheltering smugglers, and building forts like they were expecting a siege. The Nawab, understandably annoyed, tried to push back. What followed was a series of escalating snubs, insults, and outright threats. And then came Siraj-ud-Dowla, a teenage Nawab with the misfortune of becoming a historical footnote. He took a stand against British arrogance, marched on Calcutta, and briefly captured the company's fort. There was chaos, death, and the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta, a night in which a number of British prisoners died in a cramped cell. The numbers are still debated. The incident, however, became imperial legend, painted in horror and used as justification for vengeance. Enter Robert Clive, a former company clerk turned soldier. Clive was bold, ruthless, and possibly one bad day away from becoming a Bond villain. In 1757, he led a small British force to a place called Plassey, armed with a few thousand troops and several heavy chests of silver. That last bit was key. Clive didn't win the Battle of Plassey through military brilliance. He bribed key commanders in Siraj's army, sowed confusion, and let betrayal do the heavy lifting. The battle was short. Siraj was captured and later killed. The company installed a puppet ruler and took control of Bengal's treasury. Historians still argue whether Plassey was the beginning of British Empire in India. It certainly felt that way. With Bengal under company control, the door to deeper conquest was wide open. More importantly, the money began to flow. British officials suddenly had access to Indian revenue streams, land taxes, trade duties, and tribute payments, all without technically ruling the land. It was colonization without paperwork, and the Mughal emperor, still technically in charge. He even confirmed British rights to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. But by then, he was little more than a ceremonial figure, a dusty seal on a British letterhead. Here's the quirky bit. While India was being bled dry, the company's books were booming. But in London, investors didn't always know or care how this money was made. Dividends were up, shares soared, and the British public, charmed by tales of spice and silk, happily invested in what was fast becoming the world's most profitable extortion racket. Inside India, however, the mood was less rosy. The company's behavior in Bengal turned from greedy to predatory. They raised taxes, interfered in administration, and began to treat the region like a conquered land. Indian peasants and merchants, once thriving, were crushed under the weight of British demands. Famines loomed on the horizon, not as accidents of nature, but consequences of misrule. Meanwhile, the company developed an elite officer class, well-dressed, well-fed, and increasingly insulated from the people they ruled. They threw balls, hunted tigers, and sent flowery letters home about the exotic Orient. They romanticized the land, even as they quietly emptied its coffers. Remember Thomas Roe from earlier, the ambassador who once begged for scraps at the Mughal court? His spiritual successors now rode elephants and demanded tribute. The company had gone from knocking politely to kicking down the doors and rearranging the furniture. And yet, for all its bluster, the British presence in India was still precarious. They didn't have the numbers to rule outright. They relied on Indian soldiers, Indian bureaucrats, and Indian accountants. The entire system was a house of cards, propped up by debt, fear, and the illusion of control. But illusions, as we'll see, can last a very long time, especially when backed by cannon fire and quarterly profits. By the late 1700s, British factories no longer resembled warehouses. They were now full-blown fortresses, thick-walled, cannon-bristling outposts with Union Jacks flapping overhead and parade grounds echoing with musket drills. But these weren't just military installations. They were headquarters, administration centers, vaults, and perhaps most importantly, they were where India's money was being carefully measured, counted, and shipped out by the cartload. From places like Fort William in Calcutta and Fort St. George in Madras, the East India Company ran not just trade routes, but governments. With Bengal effectively under its thumb, the company now had access to an entire economy, and it began to tinker with it like a child pulling apart a clock. What followed was a frenzy of economic engineering, some of it deliberate, some of it pure arrogance, and none of it particularly good for the people who actually lived there. They introduced something called the permanent settlement in Bengal, basically a tax farming system on steroids. The idea was simple: fix the land revenue forever, hand over tax collection to local landlords, zamindars, and let the company sit back and collect the profits. What could go wrong? Plenty. The fixed tax rates didn't account for crop failures, floods, or, basic human reality. If the harvest was bad, tough luck. The taxes still had to be paid. Zamindars often squeezed peasants beyond endurance, and if they couldn't pay, their land was auctioned off. It was like monopoly, but with real rice fields and actual starvation. Wealth was sucked upward, and the countryside began to fray. Meanwhile, Indian industries, especially textiles, started to unravel. Bengal's weavers, once the envy of Europe, now found themselves producing cloth, not for profit, but for survival. The company dictated prices, demanded quotas, and enforced contracts with soldiers. In some cases, weavers were reportedly forced to sign long-term agreements under duress, or had their looms destroyed to prevent them from working independently. That whole free trade thing, more like forced trade. This wasn't colonization through conquest, it was colonization through contracts. Yet back in London, the company's directors were smug. Dividends rolled in, political influence expanded. Company nabobs, men who had gone to India poor and returned disgustingly wealthy, began buying seats in Parliament, sponsoring art galleries, and commissioning country mansions with names like Calcutta House. The British elite had a new pastime, profiting from places they couldn't find on a map. Quirky side note, many of these returning nabobs brought Indian servants with them. The sight of a turbaned attendant serving punch in a Yorkshire drawing room was both fashionable and confusing. Some were treated as curiosities, others not so kindly, but their presence hinted at the growing cultural leakage between colony and metropole. India wasn't just under Britain's thumb, it was quietly infiltrating its imagination. Still, India wasn't conquered yet. The company's hold was strong in Bengal and spreading south, but much of the subcontinent remained in local hands, especially the Marathas, Mysore, and the Sikhs. These weren't passive players. They had their own ambitions, armies and treaties, and they weren't going to give in without a fight. Enter Lord Wellesley, the Governor-General, with a flair for drama and a younger brother named Arthur. Yes, that Arthur, as in the future Duke of Wellington. Wellesley had a vision: expand British control through something called subsidiary alliances. The pitch: Indian rulers could keep their thrones if they accepted a British garrison in their territory and agreed to consult the company on all foreign affairs. It was like buying protection from a gangster and being told how to decorate your living room. Some rulers signed willingly, others were strong-armed. A few resisted, famously, Tipu, Sultan of Mysore. Tipu was no fan of British interference. He modernized his army, used rocket artillery, and even tried to ally with the French. But after multiple wars he was defeated in 1799, killed in battle, and his treasury looted. Among the spoils, his famous toy tiger, a mechanical piece showing a tiger mauling a British soldier while emitting growls. The British loved it. They put it in a museum. Historians still argue whether the company's expansion was reactive or planned. Some claim it just responded to local threats. Others say it had a clear imperial blueprint. Most agree, though, that the pace of conquest accelerated wildly in the late 18th century. With every defensive treaty came more land, more revenue, and more soldiers. The company's army grew vast, over 200,000 men by the early 1800s, the majority of them Indian sepoys. They were trained, drilled, and dressed in British style, but often paid less and treated with condescension. Still, they were effective. They helped conquer other Indian kingdoms, sometimes fighting against their own countrymen, in a tangled mess of loyalty, duty, and economic necessity. And yet within company circles, a strange hypocrisy emerged. Officials began writing long-winded treatises about Indian culture, its religions, laws, languages, often with admiration. Orientalism, they called it, a sort of scholarly exoticism that made Indian civilization seem ancient, noble, and conveniently stagnant. British rule, they claimed, would preserve it. By preserve, of course, they meant dominate politely. British judges studied Sanskrit. Officers translated Persian poetry. Bureaucrats tried to codify Hindu law, using texts no one had read in centuries. It was part scholarship, part performance, and part cover story for empire. Meanwhile, in Indian cities, resentment simmered. The British were no longer just traders. They were rulers. Their forts loomed over temples. Their regulations strangled commerce. Their courts overruled local justice. They introduced new police, new taxes, new laws, often without understanding the societies they were reshaping. But to a casual observer in 1800, it might not have seemed so bad. Roads were being built, coins minted, postal systems expanded. The surface looked orderly. Underneath, though, the soil was cracking. The balance was unsustainable. The company's rule had become too greedy, too clumsy, too confident. And India? India was watching, waiting, breathing. It started, as great disasters often do, with one man's overconfidence and another's underestimation. The man in question was Robert Clive. Yes, that same clerk-turned-commander from Plassey, now strutting around like a warlord with a quill. Fresh from winning Bengal, Clive set his sights on institutionalizing the company's grip. He wasn't thinking in terms of trade anymore. He was thinking in terms of sovereignty. After the 1757 victory at Plassey, the East India Company installed a pliable Nawab in Bengal, who essentially rubber-stamped their decisions. But that wasn't quite enough. In 1765, the company took a bold step. It obtained the Diwani rights from the Mughal emperor, essentially the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. On paper, the emperor still ruled. In practice, the company now controlled the cash register. The new system was strange. The company ran the finances, but didn't technically govern. They left civil administration to the Nawab, at least officially. What this created was a beautiful storm of responsibility without accountability. The company demanded taxes and tribute while denying blame for the consequences. And those consequences came fast. The people of Bengal, already battered by corruption and war, now faced what could politely be called tax intensity, and less politely fiscal vampirism. The company's agents, many of them clueless about local agriculture, raised taxes even as harvests failed. They demanded cash from a land that still bartered, and then came 1770. That year, Bengal was struck by a devastating famine, triggered by drought, worsened by British policy, and exacerbated by indifference. Estimates say around 10 million people died. That's nearly a third of Bengal's population at the time. Fields lay fallow, villages emptied, bones whitened the roads. And how did the company respond? By increasing taxes. Yes, really. They argued that revenue must be maintained. Profits couldn't drop just because people were dying inconveniently. Clive, for his part, had already returned to England by then, drowning in scandal, riches, and a deeply questionable mustache. He was later investigated for corruption, but defended himself, with a straight face, by saying he'd only taken moderate sums. He died by suicide a few years later. History, as you can imagine, is still divided on whether he was a brilliant strategist or a glorified corporate thug. Back in India, the company was learning a valuable lesson. It's hard to run a country without knowing what on earth you're doing. The famine had exposed their incompetence, but it hadn't broken their grip. If anything, it taught them to get more involved. Enter Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of Bengal. He was a complex man, half reformer, half opportunist. He tried to clean up the company's act, implemented judicial reforms, and promoted learning. He also oversaw brutal military campaigns, political intrigue, and a system that still funneled wealth toward Britain at the expense of India's poor. Hastings once compared British rule in India to holding a wolf by the ears. He wasn't wrong. And then came 1781, the year the company truly became a colonial power in more than name. After more battles with regional rulers, especially the Marathas and Mysore, the company began absorbing territories at a rapid pace. They didn't just want trade routes anymore. They wanted land, labor, and loyalty. But all this territory came with problems. How do you run such a vast, diverse region without collapsing under your own paperwork? Their solution: bureaucracy. Glorious, paper-choked, jargon-laden bureaucracy. Laws were translated, districts carved out, collectors appointed. Every British official became a kind of mini-king, ruling over a slice of India with the arrogance of someone who thought cumin was spicy. They introduced record-keeping systems, tax ledgers, civil codes, often based on half-understood interpretations of Hindu and Islamic law, filtered through British assumptions. It was like trying to build IKEA furniture with instructions in Sanskrit and Latin. Meanwhile, the company kept expanding its army. By 1800, they had the largest standing army in India, dwarfing even those of local kings. Most soldiers were still Indian, sepoys, recruited from specific regions and castes thought to be martial by the British. The army became both a tool of conquest and a symbol of order, but order, of course, was an illusion. The British were walking a tightrope. They ruled through Indian intermediaries, fought wars with Indian soldiers, and funded their operations with Indian taxes. One economic downturn, one rebellion, one mistake, and the whole thing could unravel. And yet, the British were still convinced they were improving India. This was the age of enlightenment, after all. They spoke of civilizing the East. They built schools, codified laws, and printed maps. Some helpful, others hilariously inaccurate. They claimed to be bringing reason, justice, and roads, and they were sort of. But they were also taking silks, spices, and sovereignty, often in the same shipment. Quirky detail here. British officers loved building clubs, exclusive spaces where they could drink, gossip, and pretend India didn't exist. No Indians allowed, of course. Even the cooks were European trained. One club rule in Calcutta actually banned discussion of native matters during dinner, which seems wildly optimistic, given that native matters included famine, war, and rebellion. But hey, priority. Historians still argue whether the British at this point were reluctant rulers or enthusiastic colonizers. Some company men genuinely believed they were saving India from itself. Others were openly greedy, most were a bit of both. Trapped in the cognitive dissonance of enjoying mangoes and massacres with equal detachment, India, meanwhile, was adapting. Some elites collaborated, others resisted. In the princely states still technically independent, rulers watched the company's rise with growing unease. In villages, oral traditions began to shift. Songs, tales, and proverbs quietly reflected the new power dynamics. Even rebellion had to be whispered first. The British forts, once lonely outposts, were now hubs of imperial power. From their shaded verandas, colonial officials looked out at a land they barely understood, but felt deeply entitled to control. They saw farmers, not families, revenue units, not villages, and over it all, the Union Jack fluttered, crisp and proud in the dusty wind. And the company? It had evolved into something almost unrecognizable. No longer a mere trading firm, it was now the de facto government of a continent. Its boardrooms decided fates. Its ledgers sealed destinies. And in those ledgers, India was not a nation. It was an asset. But not all assets stay passive. It didn't happen overnight, but if you looked closely, you could see it. Something was breaking in Bengal. The money wasn't just trickling out anymore. It was gushing, and it wasn't going toward Indian roads, or schools, or even palaces. It was heading west, into company accounts, to keep the lights on in Britain's burgeoning empire, and the wine flowing in its parlours. Bengal's economy, once one of the richest in the world, was now being squeezed like a lemon that no one planned to replant. The company wasn't interested in local development. They wanted revenue. Reliable, predictable revenue. And the easiest way to get that, skip the whole trading business entirely. Just take control of land, tax the farmers directly, and eliminate the middlemen. What followed was a shift from market economics to state extraction. Company officials, mostly clueless about Indian farming cycles, soil quality, or monsoon patterns, set hard quotas for land taxes. Crops failed, pay anyway. Floods? Not our problem. Even prosperous villages found themselves sinking into debt. Those that couldn't pay saw their land seized and auctioned off to anyone with cash and company connections. And here's the twist. Many of these new landlords weren't even local elites. They were speculators, merchants, sometimes even company employees, moonlighting as private investors. They didn't care if the harvest failed because they didn't live there. They weren't eating the rice, they were cashing the checks. Meanwhile, Bengal's famed weavers were enduring a quieter kind of collapse. You've probably heard of Dhaka muslin. So fine, legend said, it could pass through a ring. That industry didn't collapse by accident. It was deliberately undermined. British merchants, who were also company agents by the way, forced weavers to sell only to them at fixed prices. They delivered advances on cloth and then slashed the prices when the goods were done. Refuse the deal. No problem. You'd just be blacklisted, or arrested, or have your looms broken. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, that some weavers were so desperate they cut off their own thumbs to avoid being forced into contracts. Even if it's not entirely true, the desperation behind the tale is, and what were the British shipping back in return? Not much. A few manufactured goods, but mostly, they were just siphoning money. This wasn't a two-way street, it was a drain. By the early 1800s, Britain's trade with India had flipped from import-heavy to export-dominated. India was buying British factory cloth, mass-produced, cheaper, and much lower quality than what it had once made itself. Historians still argue whether this counts as deindustrialization or economic sabotage. But either way, the result was the same. India's once flourishing artisanal industries were left gutted, and entire regions that had once buzzed with looms and dye vats became eerily quiet. To make matters worse or better, if you were a London shareholder, the company also discovered a little three-letter word that would come to define its imperial logic: opium. You see, China had lots of things the British wanted: tea, porcelain, silk, but China didn't want much from Britain in return. So the company hit on a brilliant, deeply unethical idea: flood China with Indian-grown opium. It was addictive, profitable, and a fantastic way to shift the trade balance. The fields of Bihar and Bengal were soon blooming, not with food, but with poppies. Farmers were often coerced into planting them, even if it meant abandoning staple crops. The company controlled production, auctioned off the product, and smuggled it into China by the ton. When the Chinese government protested, well, that didn't go great for them. Cue the Opium Wars. So now India was growing narcotics to fund a foreign war about forcing drugs into another country. And yes, this was all managed by a company with a royal charter. But don't worry, they also built railways. Well, not yet. That came a little later. But infrastructure was starting to appear. Postal services, law courts, telegraph lines. The British called this improvement. What they didn't mention was that the roads were mainly for moving troops, and the telegraphs for controlling distant provinces more efficiently. And let's not forget the salt tax.
Yes, salt, that basic mineral you need to live.
The company taxed it heavily. They controlled its production, distribution, and price. Salt became a symbol of colonial exploitation, one that would return in a big way later on, carried in the calloused hand of a very determined lawyer with round glasses. Quirky bit. British officers were obsessed with keeping records. They wrote everything down: land surveys, village boundaries, census figures, rainfall. Some of these records are still used today. Others were pure fiction, invented to justify policies, but the goal was always the same: control through paperwork. If it's in the ledger, it's law. The company didn't just alter the economy, it rewired it. Indian society, built for centuries on caste, guild, and seasonal rhythms, now danced to the beat of quarterly profit margins. Cotton was grown not where it made sense, but where demand said it should be. Whole communities shifted from food to cash crops, and when the market crashed, there was no safety net, because safety nets aren't very profitable. And through it all, Indian elites were in an awkward position. Some collaborated, hoping for favors, land grants, or titles. Others resisted quietly, through poetry, refusal, or strategic silence. But the system left little room for neutrality. You were either useful to the company, or you were in the way. This, then, was the great pivot, from merchants with muskets to bureaucrats with armies, from trade to taxation, from commerce to control. India had once been the crown jewel of a global economy. Now it was being hollowed out from the inside. Wealth still flowed, but not to the weavers or the farmers or even the kings. It flowed to London, to warehouses, to shareholders, and it flowed quietly. No drums, no battles, just ledgers, and poppies, and weavers who had forgotten what their thumbs were for. You could hear it before you saw it, a shrill metallic scream slicing through the morning haze, followed by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on iron. The train was coming, a miracle of steam and steel, thundering across rice fields and camel tracks, trailing black smoke and Queen Victoria's vision of order. Trains, the British promised, would modernize India. They would knit together distant provinces, reduce famine, boost trade, and usher in progress. And yes, the railways were impressive. Engineering marvels that crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts with a stubborn sort of efficiency. But let's not get misty-eyed just yet. These weren't built to help Indians get to their auntie's house faster. They were built to move goods, troops, and revenue, mostly in that order. By the 1850s, the company had started laying the first tracks, and by 1900, India had one of the largest railway networks in the world. That scale is important. It sounds generous, futuristic, even benevolent, but look closely at where those rails went, not into villages or famine zones, but between cotton fields and ports, coal mines and depots, army barracks and major cities. It was a web, yes, but one spun for control. Financing it was a trick of imperial math. The British used something called the guarantee system, where private investors built railways, and the Indian taxpayer guaranteed them a fixed return, even if the line lost money, which it often did. In other words, British companies took the profit, and Indians picked up the bill. Neat. Still, for many Indians, The trains were magical. They shrunk vast distances. Pilgrims could reach temples faster. Traders could move goods further. And for the first time, people from different castes and regions found themselves packed into the same carriage, breathing the same dusty air, side-eyeing one another over luggage. It was uncomfortable, revolutionary, and occasionally smelly, but it was real change. At the same time, the British were busy creating a class of Indian rulers they could rely on. The princely states, some 500 of them, were allowed to keep their thrones, palaces, and elephant processions, so long as they knew who really ran the show. These Rajas and Nawabs signed treaties called subsidiary alliances, which effectively turned them into decorative accessories of the Raj. They kept the costumes, the British kept the power. These rulers became a sort of imperial middle class honored at durbars, those big imperial ceremonies with fireworks and fainting goats, given British titles, and invited to London for tea with actual dukes. Some played along, others seethed quietly behind gilded mirrors. But rebellion was risky. Because rebellion meant armies, and trains now made those armies terrifyingly fast. Historians still argue whether the British were consciously using technology as a weapon. Some say the railways, telegraphs, and canals were genuine attempts at development. Others point to the carefully restricted access, how rural schools got no funds, while railway contracts bloomed like opium poppies. The truth, again, lies somewhere in between. The British built, but always with an eye on their own interests. Take the telegraph. Invented in the mid-1800s, it reached India soon after and was quickly co-opted into the imperial machine. It allowed governors to send messages from Calcutta to Bombay in minutes rather than weeks. Military orders zipped across provinces, and when mutiny finally did erupt, as it soon would, the telegraph would help crush it. But even as cables hummed and trains roared, something older stirred. In dusty courtyards and university halls, among lawyers, poets, and clerks, a new idea was taking shape, that India could be more than a province, more than a resource, more than a subject. It could be a nation. For now, though, the British were too busy measuring things. They loved measurement, calendars, rainfall charts, caste registers. They conducted massive surveys, listing every temple, well, and goat within arm's reach. It was part science, part control. If they could label it, they could tax it. If they could tax it, they could rule it. But some measurements went further. They began classifying people into castes, tribes, races. They recorded customs and drew maps of backward versus civilized regions. British officials, often with the self-assurance of a drunk mapmaker, decided who was loyal, who was martial, and who needed uplifting. Whole communities were pigeonholed based on nothing more than hearsay and musty Sanskrit text, quirky detail. Some of these caste categories were invented or formalized by the British themselves. They needed social boxes to fit their census, so they created them. Over time, these boxes hardened into identities that continue to shape modern India. Yes, colonial bureaucracy basically invented paperwork-based destiny. And then there were the schools. The British created an education system to produce what one official famously called a class of persons Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. You can almost hear the smirk. These new English-educated Indians read Shakespeare, wrote essays, and quoted Locke, but were still barred from senior posts in government, because knowing Hamlet doesn't qualify you to govern your own homeland, apparently. Still, this new class began asking awkward questions about rights, about representation, about why a company was running a country. It wasn't a revolution yet, but it was a rehearsal. Back on the ground, the Indian countryside was shifting. Fields once used for food were now growing cash crops: cotton, indigo, tea. This was great for British textile mills and tea addicts. Less great for hungry villagers. Famines became more frequent, more lethal, not because of nature, but because of policy. When food was scarce, the British didn't ban exports, they just raised prices. It all sounds a bit dystopian, doesn't it? Steam engines powering empire, telegraph wires transmitting control, schools creating obedient clerks, princes reduced to ceremonial dancers at British weddings. But that's the trick of empire. It wears a top hat while emptying your pantry. And the British? They weren't slowing down. They were standardizing coinage, fixing postal routes, building universities with just enough access to look generous, and just enough exclusion to stay in charge. India, by the mid-1800s, was a place of contradictions. Trains next to bullock carts, courts next to ancient banyan trees, students who could recite Milton while being denied a voice in their own country's laws. The empire was getting slicker, faster, shinier. But underneath the iron tracks and silk turbans, the pressure was building. By the 1850s, the British had crafted a machine, one powered by taxes, greased with bribes, and maintained by a patchwork army of Indian sepoys. On paper, it looked magnificent. Revenue streams were stable. Railways connected the empire. Cotton flowed to Manchester, opium to Canton, and tea to the breakfast tables of Britain's rising middle class. But in India, the cracks were growing, and one of the deepest ran straight through the sepoy ranks. Let's pause here to meet the sepoy, the Indian soldier in British uniform. He drilled in English, followed commands in English, and was subject to British military law, often harsh, often arbitrary. These were men drawn mostly from high caste groups in northern India, especially the Brahmins and Rajputs of the Gangetic Plains, chosen for their supposed loyalty and martial spirit. They were well trained and crucially underpaid. These men weren't just fighting in distant wars, they were policing their own people, guarding tax offices, enforcing colonial laws, and somewhere in the corners of their well-drilled minds, something began to itch. In 1857, the itch exploded into fire. It began, oddly enough, with animal fat. The British had introduced a new Enfield rifle. To use it, soldiers had to bite off the ends of greased cartridges, rumored to be coated with cow and pig fat. For Hindu sepoys, cows are sacred. For Muslims, pigs are unclean. For both, this was spiritual defilement, with a side of imperial tone deafness. The British, in their usual fashion, dismissed the complaints. It was all superstition. The cartridges were fine. Don't make a fuss. Except, of course, they weren't fine. The rumor spread like wildfire, and then someone lit a match. In Meerut, sepoys refused the cartridges. They were jailed. Their comrades broke them out. The rebellion began. What followed is still debated. Was it a mutiny, a war of independence, or something in between? Historians still argue whether the uprising was spontaneous or planned, nationalist or regional, secular or religious. The truth, as always, is messy. But what's clear is this: it spread fast, from military barracks to marketplaces, from north to central India, Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, cities with centuries of Mughal legacy, saw fierce fighting. Old grievances burst to the surface. Farmers, artisans, dispossessed nobles, angry peasants, everyone had a reason. The rebels weren't unified. They had no central command, no clear strategy, but they had rage. Against taxes, against injustice, against a foreign power that ruled without understanding. In Delhi, the rebels reinstated the aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, a poet-emperor who spent more time writing ghazals than issuing orders. He was a figurehead, a symbol of lost glory. But for a moment, India's rebellion had a banner. The British response was brutal. Once they realized the scale of the uprising, they regrouped. Reinforcements poured in from Britain. Loyal Indian soldiers were used to crush the rebels. The siege of Delhi was savage. Kanpur witnessed massacres on both sides. At Lucknow, the British held out for months in a desperate, dusty defense that became legendary. When it was over, the retaliation was merciless. Rebels were hanged, shot or blown from cannons. A grim old Mughal punishment revived with colonial efficiency. Entire villages were razed. Civilians caught in the crossfire were given little mercy. The message was clear: challenge the empire, and you pay in blood. And yet, beneath the horror, something had shifted. The rebellion had exposed the limits of company rule. It was too fragile, too greedy, too careless with the people it relied on. London got the message. In 1858, the British Crown formally dissolved the East India Company. Goodbye spreadsheets. Hello Empire. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation assuring her beloved Indian subjects that they would be treated fairly. their religions respected, and their lands secure. It was a lovely document full of flowery language and empty promises. Now, India was officially part of the British Empire, a jewel in the crown, a colony, no more middlemen. The crown ruled directly, and from that point on, British politicians would speak of the Raj, a term that meant rule, but also implied something grand and eternal. Quirky side note, Queen Victoria never actually visited India. She ruled it from afar, sipping tea in Windsor, while writing letters to her Indian attendant, Abdul Karim, whom she later made her Munshi teacher. Their friendship scandalized the British court and inspired movies a century later. Back on the subcontinent, changes followed quickly. The British restructured the army. Fewer high-caste Hindus, more Punjabis and Gurkhas, considered more reliable. They began favoring Sikhs, who had remained mostly loyal during the rebellion, and shifted recruitment to what they called martial races. Yes, they actually used that term. Education policy was retooled. English became more dominant. Indian princes were pulled even closer into the imperial orbit. The railways expanded, so did telegraphs, and colonial architecture bloomed across Indian cities. Grand, Victorian buildings meant to symbolize British permanence. Think Gothic domes, clock towers, and endless echoes of Big Ben in stone. And yet the rebellion had left psychological scars on both sides. For the British, it was a betrayal. They had imagined themselves as enlightened rulers. The violence shattered that illusion. They became more defensive, more segregated, more obsessed with control. For Indians, it was a moment of tragic heroism. It didn't succeed, but it had happened, and that mattered. Folk songs told the stories. Oral histories remembered the names. The dream didn't die, it just went quiet. Even now, 1857 sits uneasily in the historical memory. Was it the first independence movement, a feudal revolt, a desperate lash against modernization? Scholars debate it in conferences, locals whisper it in stories. Either way, it proved something important. India could resist, and it would again. After the blood dried and the rebels were buried, or displayed, the British began their empire's makeover. The company was gone, disbanded like a scandalous party guest who drank too much and broke the furniture. In its place stood the crown. Respectable, regal, slightly delusional. The British Raj was born in 1858, with a promise to govern India more gently, more wisely, and with far less embarrassing rebellion. But the structure didn't change as much as the stationery. India still paid for its own rule. British officials still ran everything, and Indian voices, still limited to polite suggestions that were promptly ignored. The Crown painted over company policies with royal flair. They introduced a new civil service, open in theory to all Indians, provided you could pass an exam held in London, in English, requiring knowledge of Latin and cricket statistics. Shockingly, not many Indians passed. Still, the new Raj needed to look stable, so they staged spectacles. The 1877 Delhi Durbar, for instance, an imperial costume party so extravagant it made Versailles look like a church picnic. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, though she was in no danger of ever visiting. The Durbar had elephants, fireworks, and enough imported lace to blanket the Thar Desert. Indian princes attended in robes studded with rubies, bowing to British officials who couldn't name 3 Indian rivers. The idea was clear: unity through theatre. India was one grand empire, ordered and loyal, with Britain at the helm. Never mind that beneath the bunting, half the country was hungry and taxed to the bone. And speaking of taxes, India was still footing the bill for its own occupation. The British Raj ran on a budget funded by land revenue, salt taxes, and customs duties. Education, sanitation, and health got crumbs. Railways, telegraphs, and the army, feast. And the army mattered more than ever. After the trauma of 1857, British officials became paranoid about loyalty. They overhauled recruitment. Indian regiments were divided by region, caste, and religion. To prevent unified dissent, communication between units was restricted. Ammunition was stored in guarded depots. They trusted Indian soldiers, just not too much. Meanwhile, Indians were trying to process what had just happened. For elites, the rebellion had shown the limits of armed resistance. Many turned instead to pen, paper, and policy. They wrote books, founded debating societies, and started asking awkward questions in English. Why couldn't educated Indians hold higher office? Why were we taxed more heavily than British citizens? Why does that railway line go to a tea plantation and not a hospital? The answers were long, vague, and usually involved words like civilizing mission. But resistance was shifting. It was no longer just the domain of warriors and rajas. Now it was coming from lawyers, professors, and journalists. One such group formed the Indian National Congress in 1885. It wasn't a revolution yet, more like a petition club. The early members wore suits, quoted Burke, and begged for political reform. With heartbreaking politeness, the British mostly nodded, smiled, and filed the requests under things to ignore. Still, the Congress was a seed. Meanwhile, rural India was groaning. The economy was structured for export, not subsistence. Farmers grew indigo, cotton, and tea crops that fed British industries, not Indian stomachs. When harvests failed, or global prices dipped, Indian peasants took the hit. Debt soared, famines followed. Between 1876 and 1902, multiple famines swept India, tens of millions died. And here's the kicker: the British didn't stop grain exports. In fact, they often continued them. The market, they said, must not be interrupted. To intervene would be unwise. It was Victorian economics at its most lethal. One famine administrator, Sir Richard Temple, even reduced rations to prove that Indians could survive on less. His logic? Efficiency. His victims? Countless. Quirky but horrifying detail. During one famine, rations for able-bodied workers in British-run relief camps were set below those given to inmates in Nazi concentration camps decades later. The data exists. Historians still shudder. And yet, the empire marched on. India's railways expanded rapidly, not to bring aid to famine-struck areas, but to move crops and soldiers. Steel rails were laid while villagers starved. Telegraph lines blinked with news of empire-wide ceremonies, while entire regions buried their dead quietly in fields where poppies would grow next season. At the same time, Indian cities began to change. Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras swelled with new buildings. Universities, libraries, courts. They looked like transplanted slices of England, complete with clock towers and cricket pitches. British civil servants lived in insulated neighborhoods called cantonments, where Indian entry was tightly regulated, unless you were there to sweep, cook, or salute. But inside these cities, something else was taking root. Print culture. Indian-run newspapers, published in English and local languages, began to question the empire. Gently at first, then not so gently. Journalists were arrested. Some papers were shut down, but the words had been printed, and words once read are hard to unread. This was also the era of the census. The British, ever fond of categorizing things, launched a massive headcount of the Indian population. They documented religion, caste, occupation, and even moral character. Entire communities were officially labeled as criminal tribes based on stereotypes and paranoia. These labels, meant to make ruling easier, ended up hardening divisions that still echo today. And yet, through all this, the empire insisted it was benevolent. It had abolished sati, they reminded everyone, built universities, banned child marriage, sort of. That Indians still couldn't vote, hold high office, or shape policy was just a timing issue. Historians still debate whether the Raj was a masterclass in exploitation or a mixed legacy of development and disaster. But to most Indians living under it, the verdict was simpler: they weren't free, not yet, and the pressure, once again, was building. The year was 1900, and Queen Victoria was still reigning, if only on paper, in India. The British Raj had settled into a grim sort of rhythm: extract, tax, parade, repeat. From hill stations in Shimla to bureaucratic offices in Calcutta, British officials now thought of their rule as eternal, like the Himalayas or awkward small talk at tea. But the mood was shifting. The Indian National Congress, once a drawing room society of polite reformers, had begun growing teeth, not fangs, yet, but definitely molars. The Congress still believed in dialogue, letters, petitions, respectful appeals, but a younger generation of Indians was growing impatient. They'd studied in British-style schools, read Mill and Macaulay, and noticed something peculiar. The liberal freedoms described in those books stopped at Bombay Harbour. They started asking, if the British believed so deeply in liberty, why didn't it apply to their colonies? If empire was a partnership, why was one partner doing all the work and the other drinking all the gin? The answers never arrived, but the questions multiplied. One of the biggest catalysts for change came from an unexpected source: curried tea, well, more accurately, tea plantations, and salt, and cotton. The economy was beginning to tighten around India like a silk noose. Colonial policy had turned millions of acres into monoculture fields: opium, tea, jute, cotton, depending on what the empire needed that year. When demand dropped or disease struck the crops, entire districts starved. Famines became structural, predictable. You could chart them like the monsoon. By 1900, over 20 million Indians had died in such famines since the start of British rule. And yet, grain exports continued. Why? Because interfering with the market was against British economic principle. Starvation was regrettable, but intervention positively un-British. Then came the viceroys. After 1858, Britain ruled India through a viceroy, a kind of imperial CEO with peacocks. These men were selected for their loyalty to London and their ability to project calm while quietly rerouting India's wealth. Some were reformers, some were fossils. Most lived in palaces, rode in elephant-led processions, and governed with the confidence of people who had never eaten a chili. To the average Indian, the viceroy might as well have been a god or a ghost. His policies could determine the price of grain, the shape of taxes, or which dialect got taught in schools. But his face was on coins, not in villages. The Raj had become a system so massive, so bureaucratic, and so impersonal that resistance began to feel like the only personal act left. One man who started to change everything was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a fiery orator from Maharashtra. Tilak took nationalism out of the elite salons and into the streets. He blended politics with religion, holding mass public festivals honoring Hindu gods, while quietly criticizing the British. "Swaraj is my birthright," he declared, "and I shall have it." That line hit different. His message spread, especially among the youth, and it terrified the British. So they did what empires do: they jailed him, twice. But jailing one voice only created 100 more. Across India, new leaders began to rise, some moderate, some radical. All agreed on one thing: the days of passive obedience were over. Meanwhile, global politics was shifting. The early 20th century brought revolutions, wars, and rising nationalist movements around the world. India was watching and learning. The empire had taught its subjects how to read. Now they were reading everything. The British, sensing the mood souring, tried a new trick: reform in slow motion. They introduced the Indian Councils Act of 1909, known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. It allowed a few more Indians into legislative councils, but only the wealthiest, most obedient ones. It also created separate electorates for Muslims, beginning a strategy of divide and manage. British officials insisted this was about protecting minorities. Critics said it was more about ensuring Indians never unified. Historians still debate whether this was well-meaning inclusion or pure colonial calculus. Probably both. Either way, the result was confusion, resentment, and a growing sense that playing by imperial rules was a losing game. And then came World War I. In 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and without asking, declared India's participation too. Over 1 million Indian soldiers were sent to fight in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. They dug trenches in Flanders, rode camels in Sinai, and marched through Mesopotamia, under Union Jacks and freezing rain. These soldiers fought bravely. Many died, and many came home changed. They had seen the world. They had fought for an empire that still treated them as second class. And they had questions, big ones. Meanwhile, back in India, the war economy brought inflation, food shortages, and more taxes. And after the war, When India expected gratitude in the form of political reform, what it got instead was the Rowlatt Act of 1919. Essentially, the British decided they could now arrest Indians without trial. Happy end of war. Protests erupted, and in Amritsar, British Brigadier General Reginald Dyer decided he'd had enough of all this freedom talk. On April 13, 1919, during a peaceful gathering in Jallianwala Bagh, his troops opened fire on unarmed civilians, men, women, children, anyone in the park. They fired for 10 minutes straight. 1,650 bullets. No warning, no exit. The official death toll was around 3079. Locals claimed it was much higher. Either way, it shocked the world. Even the British Parliament split on how to respond. Some called Dyer a butcher, others called him a hero. The House of Lords gave him a pension. Rabindranath Tagore, India's Nobel laureate poet, renounced his knighthood in protest, but the spell had broken. No more illusions about the empire being benevolent. No more patience with reforms. The wound of Amritsar never closed. It festered, and in that wound, a new kind of nationalism began to grow. One that was calmer, broader, and vastly more dangerous to the Raj. Because this time, it wasn't going to be armed rebellion. It was going to be something far harder to crush, a quiet refusal. The British Empire liked neat categories: rulers and ruled, loyalists and rebels, prophets and problems. But India, as always, refused to stay in its lane. As the dust settled from the Amritsar massacre, something strange began happening. Across India, people didn't rush to arms. They didn't riot, burn forts, or storm palaces. Instead, they stepped back. They stopped cooperating. They began saying no, quietly, persistently, and in ways the empire didn't quite know how to handle. At the heart of this new resistance was a figure so unexpected, so unmilitaristic, it left the British genuinely confused. A man in a homespun dhoti, thin, quiet, wearing glasses thick enough to fry ants. His name, of course, was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, but everyone called him Bapu. Gandhi had returned to India from South Africa in 1915 with a reputation for non-violent protest and a belief that moral power could defeat empires. It sounded like wishful thinking. Then again, so did trains, or tea being taxed. Gandhi's method was satyagraha, truth force. Not passive resistance, not retreat, but a firm, deliberate refusal to comply with injustice. He asked Indians to boycott British goods, resign from colonial posts, and make their own salt. Yes, salt. More on that in a moment. At first, the elite snickered. Then they noticed who was showing up to Gandhi's rallies. Farmers, artisans, women, labourers, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs. People who had never cared about the Indian National Congress were now spinning their own cloth, called khadi, and marching barefoot in dusty processions. And Gandhi, he made protest look spiritual. He fasted, prayed, refused to fight. Even when beaten, he was jailed repeatedly, and every time he came out more powerful. He turned simplicity into symbolism, and suddenly, colonialism looked not just cruel, but absurd. In 1930, he led the famous Salt March, a 240-mile walk to the sea, to make salt in defiance of the British monopoly. Sounds silly? It wasn't. Salt was essential. The British taxed it heavily. Gandhi's march exposed how the empire taxed people for existing. Tens of thousands joined. Men, women, children. Some were beaten senseless by police. Gandhi was arrested. So were thousands more. But the march worked. The world watched. Newspapers ran photos of British officers clubbing peaceful protesters. And suddenly, Britain's moral high ground turned into a salt marsh. But Gandhi wasn't working alone. A whole generation of leaders had emerged. Jawaharlal Nehru, sharp-suited and Western-educated, with a vision of a modern socialist India. Sardar Patel, hard-headed and ruthless in his organization. Subhash Chandra Bose, a firebrand nationalist who'd later split from Gandhi and raise an army alongside the Axis powers. And many more, each with their own vision, each shaped by the strange contradiction of being Indian under British law. Meanwhile, the British Empire was fraying at the seams. The 1930s brought global depression, unemployment, economic anxiety, and yet, India remained a captive market, forced to buy British goods, pay British taxes, and serve in British wars. Quirky side note, by the 1930s, British cloth exports to India had actually become less profitable than Indian handspun, but the empire kept pushing them anyway, just to keep the mills of Manchester busy. The irony, Gandhi's boycott of British cloth arguably helped revive Indian industry faster than any planned policy. Still, for all the protests, Britain held firm. They offered slow, incremental reforms. The Government of India Act in 1935 gave provinces more control, but the real power remained with the viceroy. No full independence, no real voice, just a pat on the head and a seat in the corner. And then came World War II. Once again, Britain declared India a participant, without asking India. This time, the Congress snapped. In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, a direct call for the British to leave. Do or die, he said. Not a threat, but a promise. Within hours, most Congress leaders were arrested. Protests broke out. Trains were derailed. Offices burned. British response: brutal crackdowns. Thousands were jailed. Hundreds killed. Historians still argue whether Quit India was effective or a strategic blunder. Some say it showed Indian unity. Others say it weakened the movement just when it needed strength. Either way, it proved one thing: India wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. And here's where things get complicated. While Congress leaders were in jail, Subhas Chandra Bose formed the Indian National Army, allying with Japan and Germany. His goal: overthrow British rule by force. He marched with INA troops into northeast India, briefly hoisting the tricolour flag. The British crushed the rebellion, but Bose's audacity left a mark. Many Indians saw him not as a traitor, but as a hero. This dual resistance, Gandhi's pacifism and Bose's militancy, showed just how fractured and diverse the independence movement had become. There was no single path, only a shared direction away from empire. Meanwhile, Indian soldiers were once again fighting in a global war. Over 2 million served in World War II, in every theatre from North Africa to Burma. Many returned home not just as veterans, but as witnesses. They'd seen the world. They'd seen white men bleed, and they'd seen the limits of British invincibility. The war left Britain exhausted, economically shattered, morally questioned, and increasingly aware that the sun was setting on its empire. But India wasn't waiting for sunset. It was already standing in the dusk, hands folded, quietly saying, "We're still here, and we're not going away." In 1945, Britain won the war, but lost the empire's grip. Victory had come at a price: economic ruin, political fatigue, and the uncomfortable realization that its colonies were now more liability than legacy. In India, the pressure was undeniable. The British Raj, once unshakable, now looked like an overstayed guest at its own dinner party, wearing out its welcome, while still helping itself to dessert. The Indian National Congress emerged from prison with sharpened resolve. Gandhi, older now and more fragile, still commanded immense respect. Nehru returned to political leadership with clear eyes and an urgent voice. And the people, they were restless, expectant, and no longer willing to be ruled by foreign decree. But not everyone envisioned the same independent India. The Muslim League, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had gained massive traction during the war. What had started as a platform for Muslim representation within a united India had now shifted sharply. The League demanded a separate nation, Pakistan. Why? Jinnah argued that Muslims were not just a minority, but a nation, distinct in culture, religion, and history. In his eyes, the Congress could not and would not protect Muslim interests in a Hindu-majority India. Gandhi disagreed, insisting on unity. So did Nehru, but mistrust had deepened. Historians still debate the inevitability of partition. Was it unavoidable, a tragic misunderstanding, a British strategy to divide and depart? Probably some of all three. But by 1946, the lines were hardening. Meanwhile, India was roiling with unrest. In Calcutta, Bombay, Punjab, strikes, riots, and protests flared. The Royal Indian Navy mutiny in 1946, saw Indian sailors rise up against their British officers. The mutiny was quickly crushed, but the message was clear. The armed forces, once the backbone of imperial power, were cracking. Then came Clement Attlee, Britain's new Prime Minister. He understood something his predecessors hadn't. Britain could no longer afford to rule India. In 1947, his government announced a firm deadline. India would become independent. Soon, the announcement shocked everyone. No more delays, no more white papers. The empire was packing up. The man chosen to oversee this messy divorce, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India. Charming, charismatic, and moving at breakneck speed, Mountbatten set a date, August 5th, just 5 months to redraw borders, hand over power, and pray the country didn't implode. But of course it did. Partition was agreed upon. India would be split in two, a secular, democratic India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. But no one had a plan. Borders were drawn by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been to India and had 5 weeks to divide 705,000 square miles and 88 million people. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. As the lines were drawn, crudely, hastily, villages were split, communities severed, and chaos ignited. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan. Muslims fled India. In trains, on foot, in carts, and caravans. They moved by the millions, uprooted, terrified, uncertain. The violence was unspeakable. Neighbor turned on neighbor. Women were kidnapped, raped, killed. Children were slaughtered. Whole trains arrived at stations carrying nothing but corpses. Estimates vary, but over 1 million people may have died. 15 million were displaced. It remains one of the largest and bloodiest forced migrations in human history. And the British, most of them were already flying home. Their legacy now included one of the most horrific humanitarian disasters ever recorded. Gandhi, devastated, tried to stop the bloodshed with prayer, fasting, and pleas for peace. He walked barefoot through riot-torn cities, refusing food until the violence stopped. He begged Hindus and Muslims to embrace each other again. In Calcutta, his fast briefly brought a fragile peace, but it was clear he was a man trying to hold back a tidal wave with a candle. On August 15, 1947, India woke free. Nehru stood before the Constituent Assembly and gave his iconic Tryst with Destiny speech. At the stroke of the midnight hour, he said, "When the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." But not all of India celebrated. For millions, independence meant exile, or loss, or mourning. In Pakistan, Jinnah too addressed the new nation. He had won his homeland, but at a staggering price. He died a year later, a deeply ill man, watching his vision crumble under the weight of reality. And then came January 3rd. Gandhi, now 78, was walking to his evening prayer in Delhi when he was shot 3 times by a Hindu nationalist who believed Gandhi had betrayed Hindus by asking for unity with Muslims. The man who had led a nation without raising a sword died as he had lived, surrounded by crowds, preaching peace, still believing in humanity even as it failed him. India wept. Quirky detail. Gandhi's image today is on Indian currency, but he never held a political office, never wrote a constitution, and famously never wore a suit again. After 1921, he was the moral compass of a fractured nation, not its ruler. And even in death, his message echoed louder than any speech from a throne. With independence came division, but also possibility. India set out to become a secular democracy, the largest in the world. Pakistan began its journey as a homeland for South Asia's Muslims, with its own internal struggles and triumphs ahead. And the British, they packed their trunks, folded their flags, and left. Some proudly, some bitterly, most quietly. Historians still argue whether they brought modernity or mayhem, railways or ruin, but most agree on one thing: India wasn't given independence, it took it, and not with armies, with salt, and silence, and a spinning wheel. India was free, yes, but also broken. The night of August 15, 1947, came not with trumpets but with border camps, burning villages and 2 new nations staring at each other across a blood-soaked map. Partition had drawn a hard line through people's homes, kitchens, and hearts. The empire was gone, but it hadn't left quietly. The British, now retired from empire building and halfway back to their tea gardens in Sussex, left behind something else: a system, British-style bureaucracy, law codes, railways, police structures, English-language courts. These became India's new skeleton, and oddly enough, they worked. Or rather, they didn't completely collapse, which in 1947 was a victory. The Indian civil service, once the instrument of colonial control, now became the engine of nation building. Same files, same desks, same love of stamps and carbon copies, but now serving a democracy rather than a monarch. More or less, India's new constitution was a bold document, written by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a Dalit legal scholar and social reformer. It enshrined equality, freedom of speech, and universal suffrage, a landmark text. But it also kept many British-era laws and institutions, trial by jury, abandoned, but Section 24A, the colonial-era sedition law, remained. Historians still debate whether post-independence India should have purged every trace of colonial influence. But in 1947, pragmatism won. India didn't have the luxury of starting from scratch. It had 150 million people, no industrial base, and about 4 working microphones. The state had to function immediately. So, the trains kept running, the courts kept ruling, the taxes kept collecting. And English, ironically, became the language of administration and elite education, not out of love, but necessity. India had 1,600 languages and dialects. English was neutral, and besides, every officer already had the forms in triplicate. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the story was more tumultuous. A brand new state carved from trauma. It struggled to define itself. Its founder, Jinnah, died in 1948. Power swung between civilian governments and the military. Still, Pakistan inherited many of the same colonial institutions, especially the British obsession with borders and bureaucracy. But the deeper legacy of empire wasn't just in buildings or codes, it was in mindset. Colonial rule had taught both countries to think in terms of centralization. The idea that authority comes from a capital, whether Delhi or Islamabad, was a British import. So was the habit of treating dissent as sedition, protest as nuisance, and rural poverty as an accounting issue. Even today, echoes of the British Empire hum under modern South Asia's systems. The police still wear uniforms designed in the 19th century. Land disputes often rely on maps drawn with colonial ink. Property rights, forest laws, and even tax structures still carry the DNA of East India Company spreadsheets. Quirky side note, post-independence India kept using British prison architecture and British-style jails, was so good at keeping political opponents locked up, they remained the default well into the 21st century. Why mess with a proven design? And then there's the cultural legacy. Britain left behind tea stalls, cricket grounds, missionary schools, and the English novel, for a country once looted by literary amateurs with muskets. India now produces more English language writers than Britain itself. Irony has never tasted sweeter or more caffeinated. Cricket, in particular, became a national obsession. Once a colonial pastime designed to teach discipline and hierarchy, it was hijacked and repurposed. India and Pakistan began battling it out on the pitch with the intensity of actual warfare, only with leg pads and slow-motion replays. When India beat England in a test match, it wasn't just a win, it was a cheeky act of revenge 200 years in the making. Meanwhile, the UK watched from afar as its former colony became a republic, hosted world leaders, and launched satellites. Yes, satellites. India's space program, ISRO, was founded in the 1960s and quickly made headlines by doing in millions what the West did in billions. The same country once called too backward for self-rule was now putting probes on the moon. And yet, even as India and Pakistan moved forward, the question of Britain's role never quite disappeared. Should the UK apologise for colonisation? Should it return looted artefacts, like the Koh-i-Noor diamond, still gleaming in the British crown jewels? Should school children in England learn about the famines in Bengal, the massacre at Amritsar, or the ways British law shaped post-colonial governance? Historians still argue. Some call the empire a civilizing force. Others call it daylight robbery, with decent tailoring. Most agree on this: the story isn't over. In museums across Britain, Indian artifacts still sit under glass. Bronze statues, temple carvings, manuscripts, each item tagged acquired or gifted, with footnotes longer than a Tolstoy novel. Some were stolen, some were bought, some nobody really knows. But every object tells a story of contact, not always peaceful, but always consequential. And the diaspora. Another legacy entirely. Today, more than 1.5 million people of Indian origin live in the UK. Their grandparents may have worked in railway depots, served in colonial armies, or spun cotton in Leicester mills. Their children run companies, teach at Oxford, and host bake-off. Cultural lines blur. Chicken tikka masala is considered a British national dish. And yet, for many, the legacy of empire is never far from the dinner table. Britain's global reach may have shrunk, but its imperial shadow stretches long. Meanwhile, India, once seen as the jewel in the crown, has become the jeweler. It exports software, philosophy, film, and yes, spicy snacks. But in both countries the question lingers: who gets to tell this story? The empire may be gone, but the narrative still being written. By the 1970s, India and Britain were like two exes who still shared furniture. The empire was officially over, yes, but its fingerprints were everywhere, from tax forms to tea kettles. Britain had left, but in many ways it had also stayed. In Indian law, in Indian classrooms, in Indian minds. But something new was happening now. The direction of influence was shifting, the flow was reversing, and this time, it wasn't muskets and ledgers, it was television, textiles and takeaway. Let's start with the obvious: food. Curry had gone from exotic to everyday in British life. What began as a colonial craving for spicy stews morphed into a national obsession. Restaurants popped up across the UK, run by Indian, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani immigrants, many of whom had never seen a vindaloo in their lives until they were asked to make one. By the 1990s, chicken tikka masala, a dish probably invented in Glasgow, was crowned Britain's national dish by a sitting Home Secretary. A former colony's cuisine had claimed the empire's taste buds. You could almost hear Queen Victoria gasping softly into her mango chutney. But this was about more than food. A massive Indian diaspora had taken root in Britain, first as post-war labour migrants, then as entrepreneurs, doctors, engineers, and academics. They brought with them languages, music, clothes, and culture, and Britain, slowly and awkwardly, began to change. In Leicester, sari shops nestled beside supermarkets. In Southall, Bhangra blared from car windows. Diwali was celebrated in Trafalgar Square. Cricket grounds saw flags of both nations fluttering. British identity was expanding, not always willingly, but undeniably. This diaspora was, in many ways, the empire in reverse. People from former colonies moved to the metropole, not as subjects but as citizens. They brought with them memories, grievances, recipes, and ideas. And while they didn't carry swords, they did carry remittance wires, sending billions back to South Asia, funding schools, homes, weddings, and Wi-Fi. Historians call this post-colonial entanglement. Others call it Tuesday. Meanwhile, in India, the economic tides were turning. After decades of protectionist policy, India liberalized its economy in 1991. The result? A boom. Suddenly, multinational companies were lining up to enter the Indian market. Call centers flourished. Outsourcing exploded, and somewhere between Bangalore and Bolton, the tables turned. Indian professionals began handling everything from tech support to tax returns for British companies. A man in Delhi could now troubleshoot your printer in Doncaster. A woman in Hyderabad might process your insurance claim in Hull. The joke: the sun never sets on Indian customer service. And then came Bollywood, long a cultural powerhouse in its own right. Indian cinema began reaching British screens in ways Queen Victoria could never have imagined. Films like Lagan and Bend It Like Beckham found global audiences. Indian stars walked red carpets in London, and British television discovered something crucial. Audiences liked diversity, especially if it came with a catchy dance number and a good biryani joke. But even as the culture exchanged dance moves, politics remained tangled. Debates over immigration surged in Britain. Empire nostalgia began creeping back into public discourse. Statues of colonial figures stood silently while protests grew louder. Some wanted to remember them, others wanted to remove them. The ghosts of the Raj had never really left, they just wore different hats now. Quirky twist. In 2002, the UK Foreign Office issued new training material for diplomats posted to India. It advised cultural sensitivity and understanding of India's colonial past. One section, however, noted that the empire had brought law and order. It didn't go down well. Meanwhile, India's political climate was changing too. A new generation began reclaiming history on their own terms. Colonial monuments were reinterpreted. British-era street names were swapped for Indian ones. There were calls to return stolen artifacts like the Koh-i-Noor diamond, still sitting in the Queen's crown like a very expensive ex-boyfriend photo. The Indian government began asserting itself globally, launching satellites, hosting summits, and sending tech geniuses into Silicon Valley. The country once ruled through ledgers and lashings now had nuclear weapons and a space program. Still, the relationship with Britain wasn't entirely adversarial. There were trade deals, educational exchanges, royal visits. Prince Charles was photographed doing arty. David Cameron made speeches about shared history, carefully edited ones, and Indian investment in the UK quietly ballooned, with Indian-owned companies employing thousands across British cities. Historians still argue what post-colonial actually means in this context. Does it mean Britain's colonial hangover has faded, or that it still shapes everything, just more subtly? Some say the empire ended. Others say it morphed into spreadsheets and curry nights. One thing's certain, the flow of influence is no longer one way. Children in Birmingham grow up watching Bollywood. Families in Mumbai watch the BBC. Indian universities teach Shakespeare. British universities teach post-colonial theory. Everyone is quoting each other, sometimes badly, sometimes brilliant. And what about memory? Well, memory is messy. In India, the British era is often taught as a period of exploitation and cultural erasure, but also the time when modern India's political identity was forged. In Britain, the Raj is remembered vaguely, romantically or not at all. Many know about Gandhi, fewer know about the famines. Fewer still know that India helped bankroll Britain's industrial revolution. It's easier to forget than to confront. But history doesn't vanish, it just gets packaged. In museums, in textbooks, in tourist brochures, promising heritage trails without explaining what that heritage cost. The old colonial buildings still stand in Delhi and Kolkata, converted now into courts, museums, government offices. They are used, but not always loved. And yet, in some strange way, they're still part of the architecture of modern India, not as shrines, but as fossils, as reminders, as proof that even the most powerful empire can one day be a footnote in someone else's story. Because this is the twist. Britain once ruled India. And now, India rents Britain call centers, teaches it yoga, and occasionally beats it at cricket. By the 21st century, Britain and India weren't just linked by history. They were now linked by debt, drama, diaspora, and dinner delivery apps. The empire was long gone, but its echoes remained, in passports, in poetry, in the unspoken shrug, when a British tourist mispronounced Udaipur for the third time. And so we reach the final question: who owns this history? Because for 2 centuries, Britain had written the script in British textbooks. The empire was a grand experiment in order, railways, and afternoon tea. In Indian textbooks, it was exploitation in slow motion, spiced with looting, famines, and deeply unfortunate moustaches. Somewhere between those two poles lies a far messier truth. Take the British museums. Walk through the British Museum or the Victoria and Albert, and you'll find India tucked into display cases like a well-behaved pet. There's the Tipu's tiger automaton, A wooden sculpture of a tiger mauling a British soldier, once a symbol of resistance, now a quirky gift shop postcard. Or the Amravati marbles, once part of an ancient Buddhist site, now rearranged under fluorescent lighting. And of course, the Koh-i-Noor diamond gleaming in the crown jewels, described as gifted, though that gift came from a 10-year-old Maharaja under British supervision. India has asked for its return. Britain has politely declined. Historians still debate what counts as loot, what counts as legacy. Can artifacts taken during conquest ever really belong to the conqueror? Some argue that museums preserve and protect. Others say they warehouse what they had no right to take. But beyond artifacts, there's a deeper reckoning with stories. For decades, British culture romanticized the Raj. Novels like A Passage to India and shows like The Jewel in the Crown painted the empire as exotic, tragic, noble, just complex enough to avoid blame. Generations grew up thinking the British left India better than they found it. Railways, cricket, bureaucracy. Rarely mentioned were the 3 million who starved in Bengal in 1943, as Churchill refused to divert grain, or the weavers whose looms were broken, or the farmers who went hungry so Britain could export opium to China. India, meanwhile, leaned hard into its own myths. Gandhi as the father of the nation, Nehru as architect, the British as villains, yes, but also as stagehands in the drama of Indian nationalism. Partition, too, became mythologized, sometimes simplified, sometimes blurred, depending on the politics of the day. Both countries chose their memories carefully. Quirky example, in some UK schools, students learn about Gandhi. They don't always learn that he was jailed 13 times by British authorities. In some Indian schools, students memorize Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, but skip over the collaboration of Indian elites during the colonial years. Selective amnesia is a powerful thing, but slowly, cracks appeared. In Britain, younger generations began asking questions about empire, about slavery, about statues. University campaigns like Rhodes Must Fall shook old institutions. Debates raged over whether Winston Churchill should be honored or footnoted. Even popular culture joined in, TV shows, podcasts, books, all pulling colonial history out from under the bed. In India, too, a new reckoning emerged. As the country boomed economically, many started revisiting the colonial past, not with victimhood, but with curiosity and critique. Scholars re-examined Mughal-British interactions. Artists reimagined colonial landscapes, and some just quietly started trolling British Twitter accounts with cricket stats and comments like "still salty about nothing." Fair enough. Today, both nations are democracies. Both are deeply unequal. Both are proud of their institutions and suspicious of their pasts. India has sent satellites to Mars. Britain has sent royal family members to apologize. Sort of. Trade continues. Culture flows. And every few years another British Prime Minister visits India, lays a wreath, and mentions shared history while avoiding the words sorry and reparations. Meanwhile, millions of Indians live and work in the UK. British Indians serve in Parliament, act in movies, and argue on morning TV shows. The former colony is now the face of the metropole, and maybe that's the final twist. For 200 years, Britain imagined itself as the teller of the tale, the narrator, the central character. But the empire's story is now co-owned. And in many ways, India's retelling is just beginning. No empire lasts forever. Not Rome, not Britain, not even the tax office. But stories? They're trickier. They linger. They evolve. They turn up in recipes and resumes, and the way someone side-eyes a cucumber sandwich. The British in India wasn't just about red coats and revenue stamps. It was about collision of worlds, cultures, dreams, and illusions. It was ugly. It was dazzling. It was absurd. It was brutal. It built railways. It broke families. It gave English literature a global audience. It starved millions. And now, it's history. A history no longer whispered in colonial corridors, but discussed in classrooms, argued over in Parliament, and yes, streamed in bedtime documentaries for those brave enough to listen all the way through. So, dim the lights a little lower, because here comes the ending. The war may have ended, the flag may have come down, but the empire had a knack for lingering, especially in ledgers. And in this new post-colonial phase, the British in India weren't gone so much as redirected. Because here's a not-so-fun fact: independence didn't come with a refund. India may have broken free politically, but economically, it was still in Britain's pocket. The Raj had drained India's wealth for 2 centuries through taxation, monopolies, and good old-fashioned looting. But after 1947, that damage didn't just vanish. The infrastructure left behind, railways, telegraphs, the postal system, had been designed to serve colonial priorities, not national development. They moved cotton, not children, coal, not clinics, and the economy wrecked. British trade policies had decimated India's traditional industries. Textile towns like Dhaka, once global centers of weaving, were ghost towns. Agriculture was overburdened. Millions of families lived in debt. Literacy hovered below 20. The empire's grand exit had left India with the equivalent of a half-burned tent and a box of paperwork. But independence also sparked something powerful: reconstruction. India's leaders, Nehru especially, took a gamble. They chose state-led development, big dams, heavy industry, 5-year plans, the kind of central planning Britain would have called Soviet-light, but which India saw as necessary. After all, the free market hadn't exactly freed them before. Historians still argue whether Nehruvian socialism was the right path, but in those early years, it offered something precious: control. The ability to set priorities, however imperfectly, to build a nation not as a resource for someone else, but as a place for itself. Pakistan, too, struggled with post-colonial growing pains. It had fewer resources, less infrastructure, and inherited the thorny problem of defining national identity. Created as a homeland for Muslims, it quickly found itself torn between secular politics and religious movements. And like India, it kept many of the colonial administrative structures, partly out of necessity, partly because no one knew how else to run things. One of the strangest holdovers, the civil services. These were once the jewel of the British Raj. Elite officers who governed districts oversaw revenue collection, and occasionally threw cricket matches. Post-independence, they were repurposed into the Indian Administrative Service (IS) and its Pakistani counterpart. Still elite, still exams, still mountains of paperwork. British in function, now brown in execution. And then there was law. British colonial law had been a confusing cocktail of imported codes and local customs, stirred with just enough ambiguity to keep power centralized. India kept much of it, so did Pakistan. Some colonial laws, like sedition and blasphemy statutes, outlived their creators and continue to haunt both nations today. They're used, abused, and debated, but rarely repealed. Quirky footnote: India's parliament debated scrapping the Indian Penal Code in the 2020s finally, nearly 2 centuries after Macaulay drafted it. But even now, many of its sections remain in force. Its colonial legacy in legalese. Culturally, the British didn't vanish either. In both countries, English remained the language of bureaucracy, business, and higher education. You could rise through the ranks in Hindi or Urdu, but to really move, you still needed English. Colonialism had made it the language of aspiration. That didn't disappear overnight. Schools across India and Pakistan continued to teach Shakespeare, the British canon, and yes, even Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian Education. Students memorized Wordsworth while watching Bollywood and listening to Lata Mangeshkar. It was linguistic whiplash, and somehow it worked. Meanwhile, economic ties with Britain continued. Trade dipped briefly post-independence, then rebounded. British firms still operated in the subcontinent, often through partnerships. Indian professionals studied in London. Pakistani businessmen traded through Liverpool. There was grumbling, sure, but there was also familiarity. And then came the return migration. Starting in the 1950s and accelerating in the 60s and 70s, thousands of Indians and Pakistanis moved to the UK, some invited to fill labour shortages, others fleeing unrest, like Ugandan Asians expelled by Idi Amin. They brought their languages, their food and their grudges. British factories filled with South Asian workers. NHS hospitals staffed by Indian nurses, British towns transformed, curry houses, corner shops, temples beside terraced homes. The British Empire had returned to the metropole, not with troops, but with tandoori. This migration complicated Britain's own post-imperial identity. For some, it was a welcome enrichment. For others, it was invasion by invitation. Politics shifted, so did culture. Race became central to debates about Britishness. And in the background, the colonial past sat quietly, never quite acknowledged, never quite exercised. In South Asia, the British were gone, but colonial habits stuck. Urban planning still followed British blueprints. Civil servants still quoted old memos. Police officers still wore khaki and wielded disproportionate force. And in many ways, the worst British habit of all had endured: centralized control with minimal accountability. Yet, change was happening. Slowly, politically, economically. India liberalized its economy in the 1990s and entered a new phase of global engagement. Pakistan saw periods of growth and turmoil, often driven by its strategic location and foreign policy entanglements. Both countries began to assert themselves in international forums, not as former colonies but as emerging powers. But even today, the phrase British in India doesn't quite mean what it used to. It doesn't mean red coats and cavalry charges. It doesn't mean trading posts or East India Company flags. Now, it might mean a Pakistani British MP in Westminster, or an Indian CEO of a British telecom giant, or a viral video of a British tourist misusing turmeric. It's not about domination anymore. It's about entanglement. And as you'll soon see, the reckoning isn't over. Because the past, when left unfinished, tends to phone back, usually in English. Draw a line down the map. Make it quick. Make it neat. Pretend it's just geography. Then wait. Listen. The trains start to scream. Partition wasn't just an idea, it was a movement of borders, of bodies, of fear. And if you want to understand what it meant for the British to leave India, you have to look at the railways. Those iron arteries, once built to move cotton and troops, were now shuttling refugees, corpses and trauma across the freshly carved borders of India and Pakistan. From August 1947 onwards, the trains ran full. Every carriage stuffed with people clinging to children, goats, sacks of grain, and whatever pieces of home they could carry. A family boarding a train in Lahore had no idea if their relatives in Amritsar were still alive. Some never arrived. Some did, only to find the trains returning with bloodied windows and no living passengers. Historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million people crossed the new borders in those months. Hindus and Sikhs fled west to India. Muslims fled east to Pakistan. The violence wasn't just spontaneous, it was systemic. Entire villages wiped out, caravans attacked, women abducted, raped, mutilated, sometimes taken in marriage, and sometimes never seen again. And the British, mostly gone. A few officers tried to keep order. Mountbatten toured the carnage and called it the price of independence. But it was a price others paid. Britain had sped up partition, fearing unrest, financial collapse, and the embarrassment of hanging on too long. The result was a rushed, chaotic handover. Two new nations, no infrastructure to support the migration, no clear communication, just rage and rage. The trains of partition became symbols of betrayal, of survival, of what happens when you divide a civilization with a pencil and hope for the best. And yet the same railways once laid by the East India Company would continue to run. In India, in Pakistan, they'd carry soldiers again, yes, but also school children, mangoes, cricketers. A weird kind of continuity, colonial steel, carrying post-colonial dreams. Quirky detail, India and Pakistan continued sharing railway carriages for decades after independence. Only the engine would swap at the border. In a way, that's the whole metaphor, isn't it? Different leaders, same machine. But partition didn't end in 1947. It lived on. In 1948, India and Pakistan went to war over Kashmir, a princely state whose ruler had dithered in choosing sides. He was Hindu, his population was mostly Muslim. India claimed a legal accession. Pakistan said it was betrayal. The result? Troops. Bloodshed. An international dispute that has outlasted the British Empire by 75 years, and counting. Britain had left, but its border was still burning. Meanwhile, millions of displaced families tried to rebuild lives. In Delhi, refugee camps mushroomed overnight. Entire neighborhoods changed hands. People spoke new languages in unfamiliar cities. Old identities were torn up. Some changed their names, others clung to their prayer books like lifelines. The Indian government, overwhelmed but determined, began resettling refugees, establishing legal frameworks, and recording the chaos in dusty ledgers that still sit in archives today. In Pakistan, Karachi and Lahore ballooned with new residents. The social fabric of both nations was rewritten, and always, in the background, were the partition trains. People talked about them in whispers. Survivors avoided the details. Families changed the subject. You'd hear phrases like, "We lost everything," or "We came by train," and behind those simple words, entire histories remained unspoken. Even today, partition sits uneasily in South Asia's memory. It's not taught thoroughly in schools. Politicians invoke it when convenient. Artists and writers try to capture its scale and often fail, because how do you narrate the horror of 15 million people moving at once while neighbors burned each other's homes? Historians still argue, was partition necessary? Was it an inevitable clash of nationalism, a colonial convenience, a tragic failure of leadership? The truth is probably all of the above. Gandhi, heartbroken by the violence, withdrew from public life. He had wanted a united India, pluralistic, peaceful, principled. Instead, he saw two nations born in fire and hatred. When he was assassinated in January 1948, it wasn't by a British soldier or a colonial official. It was by a Hindu nationalist who thought Gandhi had betrayed his own religion. That too is part of the legacy. India and Pakistan would go to war again in 1965, and again in 1971, when Pakistan split into two and Bangladesh was born. Another partition, more trains, more refugees, and still no resolution. But through it all, the infrastructure endured. British-built railways, British-drawn maps, British legal systems, British military drills. Both countries inherited the tools of empire and used them in new ways, sometimes for progress, sometimes for power, always in the shadow of partition. Quirky aside, one of the last remaining partition-era trains, the Samjhauta Express, ran between Delhi and Lahore until 2019. Its name meant agreement. It was often delayed, occasionally cancelled, but its very existence was a strange act of hope. Two countries once one, linked by a track that neither fully trusted, and even when it stopped, the tracks remained, rusting quietly, waiting. The British had left, the flags were folded, the maps redrawn, but empires, as it turns out, are not just made of armies or treaties, they're made of systems, and the British Empire left a bureaucracy so thorough, so intricate, that its ghost kept stamping documents long after its body was gone. In independent India, this was obvious everywhere you looked. Government buildings built under the Raj were still in use, complete with Corinthian columns and nameplates that hadn't changed font since 1927. Civil servants worked behind teakwood desks once occupied by company collectors, and every request from a land permit to a marriage certificate still needed to be filed in triplicate and routed through enough departments to make Kafka weep. India had inherited more than a country. It had inherited a way of running a country, slow, hierarchical, obsessed with record-keeping, and deeply British in temperament. In some ways, it worked. India held elections, massive ones, peaceful transitions of power, political parties formed and fractured. The India Administrative Service, IAS, a direct descendant of the colonial ICS, became the steel spine of the new republic. These officers ran the machinery, managing famines, floods, and 5-year plans, with the same clipped professionalism that once oversaw salt taxes and census forms. But not everything from the Raj was worth keeping. Many of the laws that governed Indian life remained on the books. Sedition? Still punishable. Censorship? Still possible. Police powers? Vast and unchecked. The The British had designed these laws to control a subject population. Now they were being used by elected governments on their own citizens. Historians still argue whether India should have junked the whole colonial legal system and started fresh. But in 1947, the priority wasn't philosophical, it was practical. There were riots to stop, refugees to resettle, and bridges to repair. And so the system stayed and grew. Quirky example. Until the 21st century, India still followed British timekeeping in many offices. Files were dated, as per order of the undersigned, and memos often contained phrases like, "do the needful," and "kindly oblige," remnants of colonial grammar that refused to die. Culturally too, the British legacy lingered. In elite schools, children recited Shakespeare and Wordsworth, while wearing blazers in 40-degree heat. In courtrooms, lawyers argued in English, citing precedents set by men who'd never stepped foot in Asia. Even in the military, officers drank whiskey in mess halls, with portraits of long-dead British generals smiling down. India didn't become Britain, but it couldn't unbecome it either. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the story was similar, but with different tensions. Pakistan's founding was premised on religious identity, but it still adopted British civil and criminal codes. Its military followed British drills. Its judiciary, too, inherited the colonial habit of long-winded judgments and mysterious delays. Corruption, paperwork, and authoritarian streaks, legacies of colonial governance, were repainted in new colors. Both nations, born from the same imperial womb, continued to operate on colonial machinery, now staffed by locals, but running familiar routes. Even the idea of development came from colonial roots. The British had always seen India as a place to extract from or improve, depending on the budget. Now, Indian planners spoke in similar terms: irrigation, industry, uplifting, the backward classes. The mindset of managing people like data sets never quite left. Still, India did something remarkable. It adapted the system, bent it, occasionally snapped it, but never let it stop. Despite poverty, division, and chaos, it held together. A secular republic, in a region full of fractured theocracies and military coups. Yes, it was messy. Yes, elections were rigged sometimes. But it was also one of the most ambitious experiments in democracy the world had ever seen. And in the background, the Britishness hummed on. In newspapers that still wrote editorials like colonial dispatches. In universities that taught imperial history with barely suppressed smirks. In the way Indian police officers wore their moustaches thick, curled, and vaguely Victorian. Quirky detail: India's Police Act was passed in 1861. It remained virtually unchanged for over 150 years. Officers still referred to beat constables and fanis, with inspection notebooks inherited from their colonial predecessors. The uniforms were khaki, the attitudes even khakkier. But over time, India began to outgrow the old coat. In literature, writers like Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, and Vikram Seth rewrote the English language itself, bending it into something Indian, something new. In film, the empire became a subject of satire, memory, and occasionally revenge fantasies involving well-timed song numbers. In governance, new voices rose. Dalit activists, tribal leaders, women's movements, all demanding not just reforms but recognition. They weren't interested in preserving colonial systems. They wanted to replace them. The Indian state, founded on the architecture of empire, was now being remodeled from the inside. And still, the shadow remained. In every courtroom with colonial ceilings, every passport with an English name, every bureaucrat quoting the Indian Penal Code section like scripture, the British in India didn't vanish. They just became embedded in institutions, in processes, in habits of mind. A colonizer's ghost, typing minute, collecting tolls, and occasionally still asking for forms in triplicate. Somewhere between the takeaway menus and cricket scores, something strange had happened. India, the jewel that was once pried loose by colonial fingers, was back in Britain's living room. But this time, it wasn't with salt taxes and company charters. It was with software updates, Bollywood soundtracks, and takeaway curry. The empire had reversed its flow. By the late 20th century, Britain had become home to one of the largest Indian diasporas in the world. They were no longer just railway porters and hospital staff, though they still kept those systems running. They were business owners, politicians, artists, and tech pioneers. They ran call centers, hedge funds, and entire government departments. London had changed, so had Leicester, Birmingham, and Southall. Streets once named for imperial generals were now lined with sari shops, halal butchers, and temples humming with incense. And in the background, the hum of post-colonial fusion played on, Punjabi English slang, Bhangra beats in Tesco, a Diwali, during the Premier League halftime break. The very empire that had once classified Indian identity into neat bureaucratic boxes, Hindu, Muslim, merchant, warrior, was now getting a taste of what it meant to live in a plural world. A world where your doctor might recite the Bhagavad Gita between appointments, where your prime minister might be a man of Indian descent. Yes, that happened. And this wasn't just a culture shift, it was an economic one. India's economy exploded in the 1990s. Following liberalization, foreign investment poured in. Cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad became global tech hubs. Indian firms like Tata and Infosys began snapping up British companies. Jaguar Land Rover, Indian-owned, Tetley Tea, Indian-owned. Old colonial brands were being bought by boardrooms whose grandfathers had once been colonized. Historians call this reverse colonization. It's tongue-in-cheek, sure, but the symbolism is rich. The colony now had capital. The former subject now signed checks. Even remittances became a form of soft power. Indian families in the UK sent billions home, funding schools, building hospitals, and financing the next generation of Indian entrepreneurs. The old East India Company never wired this much money in the other direction. Quirky detail: Indian origin residents of the UK are among the highest earning ethnic groups in the country. Statistically speaking, the descendants of colonized subjects now earn more, on average, than many descendants of the colonizers. That's not revenge, that's just a very British irony, served with a side of mango chutney. But the story isn't just about numbers. It's also about narrative. For decades, Britain had told the story of the empire from a safe distance, romantic, wistful, occasionally apologetic, but rarely accountable. Now, new generations of British Indians began retelling it, through novels, documentaries, podcasts, and yes, bedtime history channels. They talked about partition, not as an unfortunate political blip, but as a personal trauma, about indenture, not just as labor, but as forced migration, about empire, not as a benevolent overseer, but as a bureaucracy that made some people very rich by keeping others very poor. British schoolchildren, who once learned about Gandhi as a lovable barefoot saint, now heard about Churchill's role in the Bengal famine. University students debated reparations, looted artifacts, and whether colonial statues belonged in museums, rivers, or context-heavy plaques. At the same time, Indian identity in Britain wasn't static. It wasn't just curry and cricket. It was queer, political, hybrid, and sometimes very annoyed with its own nostalgia. The second and third generations were asking different questions than their grandparents. Not where do we belong, but why did we end up here at all? And across the channel, back in India, Britain had become background noise. A place for graduate school for NRIs to marry into, for jokes about bad food and worse weather. The emotional charge of colonialism had faded for many. What remained was sharper: legal battles for stolen artifacts, scholarly debates about economic drain, and the slow but firm reclaiming of Indian historical narratives. Even Gandhi got a rebrand. In Indian politics, he was alternately revered, ignored, or photoshopped into campaign posters. His legacy, like the empire he helped dismantle, was up for grabs. Still, the link between the two countries endured. In trade, in education, in soft power, British universities recruited Indian students by the thousands. Indian films shot in Buckinghamshire. The House of Lords occasionally debated India relations as if they still had a colonial hangover. And India, it responded with investment, diplomacy, and let's be honest, cricket wins. Because nothing quite captures the post-colonial shift like a World Cup semi-final between India and England. It's not just a game, it's psychological theatre. 22 men playing a sport introduced by colonizers, redefined by the colonized, and now monetized by both. Historians still argue whether this mutual entanglement is healthy or haunted. Has Britain truly reckoned with its empire? Has India truly shaken it off? The answer, as usual, is both yes and no. Because the past doesn't just vanish, it adapts. It sneaks into immigration law, into dinner conversations, into the way a university course on British literature includes Rushdie but not Rumi. It's the way colonial nostalgia creeps into politics, and the way Indian entrepreneurs quietly buy up those nostalgic buildings. The story of the British in India didn't end in 1947. It got a new cast, a new setting, and sometimes a London postcode. It's a cool morning in London, and a queue is already forming outside the British Museum. Inside, behind glass, under perfect lighting, sits a diamond, the size of a small egg. It doesn't belong here. It never really did. And yet, there it is. The Koh-i-Noor, gleaming in the Queen's crown, a perfectly crystallized argument about empire. The story of the British in India isn't just written in history books, it's scattered across galleries, storage vaults and gilded display cases. From the Amravati sculptures to Tipu Sultan's mechanical tiger, Britain's museums are stacked with objects collected during colonial rule. Some were bought, some were gifts, and some were, let's be honest, looted, or at least relocated without consent. The British Museum alone holds over 80,000 items from India. Only a fraction is displayed. The rest is in climate-controlled drawers, catalogued by interns in gloves, while academics squabble over provenance. That's the polite word for how did we get this without looking too closely. The Koh-i-Noor, though, is the star, probably mined in Golconda, passed between Mughal emperors, Persian invaders, Afghan rulers, and finally acquired by the British in 1849. After the annexation of Punjab, they made a 10-year-old Maharaja sign it over. The diamond was promptly cut down for Queen Victoria, shrunk, polished, and set into the crown jewels. It has since adorned Queen Alexandra, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, everyone but an Indian, or a Pakistani, or anyone from the subcontinent. India, Pakistan, Iran, and even Afghanistan have all requested its return at some point. The UK's response, usually something between polite dodging and outright refusal. One British official once quipped that if we gave everything back, the museum would be empty. Not exactly a winning argument. Historians still argue whether artifacts taken during colonial rule should be returned. Some say museums preserve them better. Others say the preservation of plunder isn't a noble act. But the debate isn't just about ownership, it's about storytelling. Who gets to tell the past? Who decides what's important? Whose voice is in the label beneath the display case? Quirky footnote: some Indian artifacts in British museums have labels that say source unknown or acquired during military campaign, as if they just floated into British hands like migrating birds. The euphemisms are almost an art form. Beyond museums, the legacy lives in names and places. India's cities were renamed post-independence as part of a slow, symbolic uncolonizing. Bombay became Mumbai, Calcutta became Kolkata, Madras became Chennai. Not everyone was thrilled, especially cartographers, but it was a clear signal. The era of anglicized geography was over. In Britain, though, many colonial names remain. Clive Street, Hastings Road, Victoria Embankment. There are statues of Lord Cornwallis, plaques for Robert Clive, busts of Queen Victoria, in public parks. The empire may be a memory, but its marble tributes are doing just fine. Sometimes they become battlegrounds. In 2020, protests following the death of George Floyd sparked a global reckoning with statues of slave traders and imperialists. In Bristol, a statue of Edward Colston was toppled into the harbour. The discussion quickly spread: should statues of imperial figures be taken down, relocated, recontextualized? And here's where the empire's legacy gets complicated. Because for some Britons, these monuments are history. For others, they're trauma cast in bronze. To one person, Clive of India is a war hero. To another, He's the man who started a famine and looted a nation. Both might be right, if history is allowed to hold contradiction. Meanwhile, back in India, there's growing pressure to reclaim not just artifacts, but narratives. Indian historians and artists are revisiting colonial stories. Not to erase them, but to reshape them, to shift focus from the white saviors and trains narrative to one that includes resistance, survival, and subversion. It's no longer about what the British did to India, it's also about what India endured, adapted, and outlasted. Even the way history is taught is evolving. Textbooks now include more on the 1857 rebellion or First War of Independence, depending on your politics, the economic drain, and the many resistances, tribal, regional, religious, that challenged colonial power. And British scholars are listening too, realizing that empire doesn't look the same from every angle. Quirky side note: in recent years, British schoolchildren have started learning about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, once just a footnote, now a case study in moral ambiguity. Some are shocked to learn it happened at all. Others are more surprised it took this long to mention. All of this, museums, names, statues, syllabi, is part of a slow cultural reckoning. Britain isn't the same country that ruled India, but it still lives in the house empire built. And India walks through rooms the British designed, but now rearranges the furniture, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a sledgehammer. The Koh-i-Noor still sparkles in the Tower of London. It draws thousands of tourists. It also draws thousands of comments. Why is it here? When will it go back? Should it? Britain has begun returning artifacts to other nations. Benin bronzes, Maori remains, Greek marbles, almost, but India's turn, still pending. Until then, the crown jewels remain a strangely accurate symbol. Brilliant, complex, disputed, and just a bit awkward when you look too closely. When the last Union Jack came down, in 1947, it didn't exactly signal a clean break. It was more like someone trying to sneak out of a house party without being noticed, hoping no one would bring up the furniture they broke. Britain left India. Yes, but they didn't really leave. Not complete, because for decades after independence, they kept popping back in, sometimes with good intentions, sometimes with nostalgic speeches, and always with a peculiar sense of entitlement. The official presence shrank. No viceroys, no colonial officers, no company clerks counting sacks of salt. But British influence lingered like old perfume in the curtains. And British citizens, many stayed. Some were born in India and didn't want to leave. Others were retirees, diplomats, or missionaries who had grown attached to the climate, or the servants, or the mangoes. And then there were the pensioners. You see, when Britain pulled out of India, they didn't just wave goodbye. They left behind thousands of ex-civil servants, railway engineers, police officers, and plantation managers, all of whom had been promised pensions. Some were paid from India's budget, others from Britain's. It got messy. Even messier was the attitude. Some of these former colonials returned to the UK only to discover that Britain didn't exactly have a place waiting for them. They were often out of touch, nostalgic for an India that no longer existed, and baffled by a nation that had moved on. They became characters in novels, the Anglo-Indian relic, sipping gin at 3 p.m. and grumbling about how the natives used to be more respectful. And then came the royal tours. For decades after independence, the British monarchy continued visiting India, symbolically, diplomatically, and photogenically. Queen Elizabeth II visited in 1961, and again in 1997, the 50th anniversary of Indian independence. The 1961 trip was all pomp, elephants, banquets, garlands. The 1997 visit, slightly more awkward. She laid a wreath at Jallianwala Bagh, where British troops had massacred hundreds of peaceful Indian protesters in 1919. The gesture was meant to acknowledge the past without actually apologizing. It worked for some. Others wanted more. Still others wanted less. One protester famously held up a sign that read, "We don't want your flowers, we want our history back." Historians still argue whether these royal tours help or hinder reconciliation. Do they offer closure or just polite distraction? Meanwhile, back in Britain, Indian food had become fully mainstream. What began as niche dining turned into a national obsession. By the early 2000s, There were more Indian restaurants in London than in Mumbai. Curry had become so entrenched in British life that politicians called it a vital part of our culture. No one seemed to mind that many so-called Indian restaurants were actually Bangladeshi, and that the national dish, chicken tikka masala, was likely invented in Glasgow. It didn't matter. Perception had replaced precision. In a way, this summed up Britain's relationship with its imperial past. Fond of the flavour, less interested in the recipe. But culture wasn't the only place India showed up. Politics shifted too. The first Indian MPs entered the UK Parliament. Community leaders gained national prominence. By the 2010s, British Indians were a visible, vocal demographic. They leaned both left and right, urban and suburban, entrepreneurial and academic. No longer the silent shopkeepers of 1970s sitcoms. They were now lawyers, doctors, mayors, and eventually, prime ministers. Yes, a British prime minister of Indian descent. Rishi Sunak's rise wasn't framed as a colonial comeback, at least not publicly. But it sent a signal. The empire's children weren't just guests anymore. They had the keys to the building. Quirky twist. When Sunak visited India for the G20 summit, Indian news outlets celebrated it like a homecoming. "The Empire strikes back," read one headline. Not with bitterness, but with a wink. He bowed before a Hindu temple and shook hands with Indian officials, navigating a diplomatic minefield laid decades before he was born. Yet the ties were not all celebratory. Britain still housed many South Asians who remembered partition, or fled from post-colonial regimes like Idi Amin's Uganda. Their memories weren't of silk and spices. They were of borders, bombings, and bureaucracies. And for them, empire wasn't quaint, it was personal. Meanwhile, Indian immigration to the UK evolved. The Windrush generation of Indian Caribbean settlers gave way to students, tech workers, and entrepreneurs. These new arrivals were less interested in colonial baggage and more in property prices, job offers, and school rankings. But even they couldn't escape the ghost of empire, because every visa form, every customs check, every media debate about immigration echoed with that old colonial question, do you belong? And through it all, Britain struggled with its past. It hosted museum exhibits about empire, but rarely addressed reparations. It taught schoolchildren about Gandhi, but skipped over the Bengal famine. It held Commonwealth Games, which sometimes felt like awkward family reunions, where half the cousins weren't sure if they were invited or inherited. The Commonwealth, that peculiar post-imperial club, limped along, founded as a symbol of unity among former colonies. It was mostly symbolic. India remained a member, but with arms crossed and eyebrows raised. Britain liked to think of it as friendship. India saw it more as fine, but don't touch anything. The long goodbye, it seemed, was still going. Even in trade, India and Britain spent years trying to negotiate a free trade agreement. It sounded modern, cooperative until they reached topics like whiskey tariffs and labor standards. And suddenly 1947 was back in the room, clearing its throat. This wasn't a relationship based on domination anymore. But it wasn't quite equal either. It was complicated, layered, civil, occasionally passive-aggressive. Like two people who once shared a turbulent marriage and now send each other overly formal Christmas cards. Because even after the soldiers left and the statues were questioned and the trade agreement signed, something remained, an aftertaste. Part nutmeg, part iron, and all history. Somewhere between the Queen's visit and the post office queues, something started to feel familiar. India, once ruled from a London desk, now found itself folded into Britain's daily life. In the strangest of ways. There wasn't an empire anymore, but there was something just as persistent: bureaucracy, Balti, and British Indians. Take a walk through a British city in the 1990s or 2000s, and the signs were everywhere, literally, gurdwaras, beside chip shops. Sari boutiques, sandwiched between betting parlours. The scent of cumin drifting through a high street where the local MP might quote Shakespeare and Tagore in the same speech. Empire hadn't disappeared, it had metastasized into culture. But for many British Indians, this was a complicated inheritance. They weren't colonial administrators or sepoys. They were descendants of traders, refugees, labourers, and survivors. And they weren't always sure what to make of the legacy they'd been handed. Some leaned into it, becoming historians, activists, or curators, determined to preserve the real stories behind the glass displays. Others tried to forget, to blend in, to make the ghost of empire shut up, while they applied for mortgages and booked their Tesco delivery slots. But they all lived with the aftershock of empire. One of the oddest places it showed up, the curry house. By the early 21st century, curry had overtaken fish and chips as Britain's unofficial national dish. Politicians made jokes about it. Mayors opened restaurants with ribbon-cutting ceremonies. There were awards, magazines, and late-night radio shows dedicated entirely to chutney pairings. It was a culinary empire of its own. But behind the steaming samosas and naan baskets was something more poignant: identity. Most of these Indian restaurants were run by Bangladeshis, many from Sylhet, who had adapted their menus to fit British palates. The food was spicy, but not too spicy. The decor leaned heavily on gold elephants and soothing sitar music. It was India, through a lens of nostalgia and initiation. And then came the second generation, born in Britain, educated in British schools, fluent in English, and often only half fluent in the language their grandparents spoke. They grew up between cultures, often being told to be grateful, even when they weren't sure what for. They watched Bollywood and BBC. They were both of Britain and other to it. Historians still debate the term model minority. It's often used to describe British Indians, pointing to high education rates, professional success, political representation. But many argue it's a trap, a way of praising one community to shame another, a way of ignoring the racism, the stereotyping, the subtle exclusions in hiring, housing, and headlines. Quirky fact: in a 2014 survey, most Britons thought Indians had done well for themselves. Few could explain how or why. Fewer still knew about the racist housing policies of the 1950s, or the anti-immigration riots of the 70s, or the daily microaggressions faced in white-collar workplaces. But British Indians weren't just waiting for approval. They were making things, writing novels, directing films, starting businesses, calling into late-night radio shows to argue about cricket and Keynesian economics. They were shaping British culture, not as guests, but as hosts. Meanwhile, back in India, Britain had become background noise. The country that once dictated India's trade routes and tax codes now sent delegations asking for deals. Indian billionaires bought London mansions, Indian students filled British university lecture halls, and Bollywood, it filmed its musical numbers on the steps of British landmarks, turning empire's architecture into pop cultural wallpaper. In a strange twist, the former colony was now Britain's economic courtship target. Trade talks ramped up. Tech partnerships blossomed. Joint ventures multiplied. India wasn't just emerging, it had emerged, with satellites, software, and GDP numbers that made city bankers sweat slightly over their sandwiches. But the emotional relationship, still weird. In Britain, the memory of empire was sometimes romanticized. Faded maps, sepia-tone documentaries, wistful nods to discipline and administrative efficiency. In India, it was sometimes weaponized, used to explain poverty, inequality, even cricket losses, and in both places, it was often misunderstood. Britain saw India as a rising friend. India saw Britain as a charming uncle who used to steal silverware, and yet they stayed in touch. At global summits, at UN forums, at student reunions, at Commonwealth meetings where no one was quite sure what the Commonwealth actually did anymore. Quirky aside, a 2021 poll found that most Indians held a favorable view of Britain. Most Britons had no idea how India worked. One group was pragmatic, the other, nostalgic. And in the middle of all this was the diaspora, millions of people with one foot in each country, acting as cultural translators, business brokers, and occasionally, dinner party referees. They weren't waiting for a statue to fall or a museum to apologize. They were busy opening law firms, launching startups, and editing Wikipedia pages to fix the bit about Clive. They understood what many didn't. That empire wasn't a chapter in history, it was a lens through which both nations still viewed the world. Sometimes it magnified opportunity, sometimes it distorted memory, sometimes it was just annoying, but it never disappeared. On a warm evening in Mumbai, someone's grandmother wires money to Leicester. A week later, someone's uncle in London wires it right back. This is not a glitch, it's a rhythm. A financial seesaw powered by cousins, contractors, consultants, and call centers. Welcome to the post-colonial loop of loans, deals, and diaspora, where the British and Indian economies now lean into each other like two exhausted roommates pretending they've always gotten along. By the 2000s, India had become a global player, not just in trade, but in soft power. Its billion-strong population wasn't just numbers on a graph. It was engineers, students, developers, and CEOs ready to rewrite the rules of the global economy. And Britain needed a dance partner who still spoke the same language and understood how to survive both bureaucracy and rain. It helped that India had been trained, for better or worse, in British systems. The legal codes, still rooted in colonial acts. The tax policies, a Frankenstein's monster of Victorian logic and modern loopholes. Even Indian banking regulation often read like it had been copy-pasted from an old colonial memo, just with more acronyms. And so when British firms looked abroad, India made sense. Outsourcing began in earnest. First came customer service, British callers accidentally pronouncing Bangalore with 3 syllables and discovering tech support workers who sounded vaguely more polite than their own family members. Then came IT, then research, then whole departments quietly relocated across oceans. By 2020, India was one of the UK's top trading partners. Pharmaceutics, technology, fashion, finance. The trade lanes once used for cotton and tea were now humming with microchips and medicines. And the money didn't just flow one way. British universities, for example, began courting Indian students like celebrities. Scholarships, recruitment fairs, glossy brochures, promising stone libraries and multicultural cafes. In 2023 alone, over 100,000 Indian students studied in the UK, bringing not just ambition, but tuition fees that kept whole departments alive. Historians still argue whether this is a new partnership or just colonialism in a nicer suit, but the numbers don't lie. India has leverage now. When a trade deal stalls, it's not always Delhi that blinks first. At the same time, the Indian diaspora in Britain evolved from shopkeepers and corner chemists to economic giants. Indian origin entrepreneurs ran restaurant empires, grocery chains, and tech firms. Family businesses turned into PLCs. The Patel Motel owner became a real estate magnate. The Sharma who once sold newspapers, now head of a fintech firm. And with money came visibility. British Indians entered boardrooms, parliaments, and television studios. They weren't immigrants anymore. They were incumbents, shaping markets, funding political campaigns, launching IPOs, winning BAFTA. Quirky detail. By the mid-2010s, British Indians were statistically more likely to own their homes, start a business, or send their children to university than the national average. This didn't mean life was perfect. Discrimination, stereotyping, and underrepresentation still existed, but the trajectory was undeniable. And all of this created a curious dynamic. When India rose, so did Indian Britain. And when Britain stumbled through economic crises or political shake-ups, there was often an Indian safety net, whether it was billionaire investors from Mumbai buying into London real estate, or high-skilled migration plugging NHS gaps. The ties remained surprisingly sturdy. But there was still tension, especially when migration became a political football. Some British politicians praised India's contribution to the UK economy, then proposed visa restrictions the next week. Others courted Indian trade deals, while making speeches about taking back control. The diaspora watched, exasperated. Many had family on both sides. They knew this dance well. But back in India, these gestures didn't go unnoticed. India had its own nationalist shifts. Movements that didn't always want to play nice with former colonizers. Trade negotiations became chess matches, not courtships. India's rising global status, bolstered by its space program, digital economy, and assertive foreign policy, meant it could now afford to say no, to push back, to demand terms. And when Britain hosted India-related summits, it was no longer a mentor. It was a peer with a complicated history and a decent tea selection. Cultural exports flowed too. Indian films, once mocked as melodrama, now premiered in London's Leicester Square. Indian fashion walked British runways. Indian festivals like Diwali and Holi turned entire neighbourhoods into technicolor celebrations sponsored by city councils, broadcast by the BBC, and hashtagged by influencers. But with visibility came scrutiny. Whose version of Indian culture was being celebrated? Was it inclusive, sanitized, appropriated? And when Britain talked about shared history, was it actually sharing or just soft-selling empire again? These questions didn't have tidy answers. Some British Indians felt pride, others, weariness, many, both. They were tired of being asked where they were really from, but they were also proud of their roots and tired of hiding them. In a strange twist, the British-Indian relationship had become less about the past and more about the present. It wasn't just redcoats and rebellion anymore. It was data protection agreements and film festivals, cricket diplomacy and whiskey tariffs, 1,000 little negotiations where power was no longer one-sided. Because the story of the British in India didn't just end, it reinvested itself through remittance wires, through student loans, through trade pacts, negotiated in suits instead of sabres. The Raj may be history, but the relationship, still under negotiation. There's a curious thing that happens when an empire dies. The maps change, the coins change, the rulers go home, but the stories stay. And in Britain, the story of India, of the Raj, never really ended. It just moved into a rearview mirror, fuzzy, selective, and strangely sentimental for something that involved so many bayonets. By the 21st century, the British public's relationship with its former empire had become something between a memory and a museum. Ask 10 people about India, and you might hear 10 different things. Gandhi, curry, trains, jewel in the crown, spiritual place, call centers. Wasn't the British Empire a good thing though? This wasn't malice. It was myth-making. The slow turning of complicated history into digestible narrative. In this version of the past, the British built railways out of kindness, administered justice with stiff upper lips, and taught English out of generosity. Famine, slavery, partition, those were unfortunate. But look, cricket. This myth is everywhere, in war memorials that honor soldiers but not sepoys. In documentaries where the narrator calls colonized people natives, with a nostalgic sigh. In royal pageantry that lovingly references Commonwealth ties, without mentioning how most of those ties were originally forged with a gunboat. Even British television isn't immune. Indian summers, the jewel in the crown, Victoria and Abdul, they recreate the Raj, with gorgeous cinematography and well-meaning scripts, often featuring a token Indian character who is noble, tragic, and inexplicably fluent in Jane Austen. It's not quite revisionism, but it's very close to emotional outsourcing. Historians still argue how much of this is conscious. Is it denial, nostalgia, an attempt to comfort a nation grappling with its diminished status in the world? Maybe it's just easier to remember your empire as Downton Abbey, with elephants, than as one of the largest acts of enforced economic extraction in history. Quirky side note, a 2016 poll found that 43% of Britons still thought the British Empire was a good thing, only 19% disagreed. That's nearly half the population preferring the abridged version of history, where nobody went hungry and everyone saluted politely. Meanwhile, India has been editing the other side of the story. Textbooks are being rewritten, statues of colonial figures have come down. Roads once named after viceroys now bear the names of revolutionaries, scientists, and poets. Even the Indian Parliament got a revamp, designed to feel more Bharatiya and less British imperial chic. And then there's the satellite launches. India's space agency has done something the East India Company never imagined. Shot rockets to Mars. It's a quiet rebuke to the old clichés. No longer the land of snake charmers and spice. Now the land of software engineers and lunar ambitions. At the same time, a younger generation in both countries is trying to talk honestly. Not about guilt, not about revenge, but about complexity. They ask, what did Britain lose when it left India? What did India gain? Why do both countries still frame the empire as something tidy when it was clearly messy? This honesty lives in books. podcasts, social media rants, and school debates. It's the child in Leicester asking why their granddad had to work double shifts in 1975. It's the teenager in Kolkata wondering why their exams are still graded with phrases like satisfactory progress. It's the Indian-American podcaster interviewing a British historian on Zoom, and both of them trying not to sigh too hard. And the weirdest part, they're still connected, not by railroads or red tape, but by memory, by old habits, by mutual recognition. The way you nod at someone in a crowd because for better or worse you've shared something complicated with them. India and Britain don't really need each other anymore. Not politically, not even economically, if they're being honest. But they keep showing up at each other's doorsteps anyway. Sometimes with business proposals, sometimes with apology tours, sometimes just with cricket bats. The empire ended. The postcards didn't. The accents blurred. But the stories still unfolding. In lecture halls, in curry houses, in uncomfortable dinner conversations, and yes, in sleepy bedtime histories, whispered softly across time zones, with a fan humming in the background. And here we are. After centuries of trade winds, treaties, tea leaves, and telegrams, the story of the British in India draws to a close, not with a bang, but with a quiet sideways glance across a dinner table. Because the final chapter of this relationship isn't written in war reports or shipping logs. It's written in silence, in what hasn't been said, in all the conversations postponed until the right time. By the 2020s, both countries were living out their post-colonial realities in full color. India, loud, chaotic, contradictory, booming. Britain, quieter, nostalgic, debating its place in the world while hosting bake-off marathons. Both democracies, both arguing with themselves, and both, every now and then, still tripping over the long shadow of empire. But here's the twist. The end of the empire didn't end the influence. Not really. The structures the British left behind, the civil service, the courts, the railways, even the bureaucracy, are still there. Bent, sometimes broken, but there. India took the blueprint and rewrote it in her own ink. Britain, meanwhile, continued carrying around a kind of imperial muscle memory, proud of what it built, less proud of how it built it. Quirky detail: there are still roads in India where the mile markers are British-era cast iron. Still temples that list their protection status under British conservation laws. Still cricket tournaments with trophies named after colonial governors. The ghosts are not subtle, and the irony, despite everything, the rebellions, the famines, the resistance, the withdrawal, the British Empire did exactly what it always claimed it wanted to do. It made India global. Not by kindness, not even by design, but by accident. India was never a passive subject. Even under colonial rule, it was learning, adapting, resisting, absorbing. When the British built schools to train clerks, India trained poets. When they built ports for exports, India used them to import revolutionaries. When they built railways for resource extraction, India rode them to independence. Historians still debate whether the British Empire was a net benefit or a net catastrophe for India. Most agree it was somewhere in between. The economic drain was real. So were the institutions, the oppression, the opportunities, the erasures, the evolution. The truth, inconveniently, refuses to fit a bumper sticker. Because the story of the British in India isn't a morality tale. It's a historical entanglement, a centuries-long tangle of commerce, conquest, and culture, of violence and fusion, of oppression and irony, of resistance songs in English, of prime ministers reciting Kipling and Bollywood stars quoting Shakespeare. And maybe that's the lesson. Empire doesn't end when the armies leave. It lingers in accents and tax forms, in museum labels and grandmother's recipes. It's in the things we build and the things we forget to question. It's in the ease with which one country assumes it's the center of another's story. But it's also in the ways people reclaim that story, rewrite it, remix it. And India, after all this time, has done exactly that. It's no longer the jewel in someone else's crown. It's the crown maker. Sending satellites to the moon, funding tech revolutions, winning cricket matches in English stadiums. And Britain has moved on. but never fully away. It lives with its history, like a slightly embarrassing tattoo. Some are proud of it. Some want it lasered off. Most aren't quite sure what to say when someone points at it. So now, as we fade from the roar of gunships and the clang of factory bells, the story closes with a softer sound. The rustle of pages in a textbook being rewritten, the ding of a WhatsApp message between Birmingham and Bangalore, the clink of a teacup in Delhi, brewed perfectly strong, just the way the colonizers accidentally taught them. So now, as the last carriages of empire vanish into the dusk, take a breath. The noise has faded, the processions are over. What remains is quieter, an echo of languages layered on top of each other, of customs borrowed and returned, of identities too tangled to tease apart completely. History, especially empire, is not clean. It doesn't fold neatly into good guys and bad guys. It stains, it sticks, and sometimes it surprises us by showing up in the most mundane places, in an insurance policy, in a school uniform, in a recipe passed down through generations that no one ever wrote down. But if you've made it this far through the palaces and protests, the telegrams and trains, maybe you're beginning to hear what that echo's been trying to say. That legacy isn't about who won, it's about who remembers and how, and who chooses to tell the story next. So let that be your gentle reminder tonight. The past is never fully gone. It's just waiting, quietly, until someone asks about the elephant in the museum, or the spice in the stew, or the funny way you pronounce schedule. History isn't asleep, it just whispers, and right now, it's saying, rest easy. You've listened well. Now dim your screen, stretch your limbs, and let the fan murmur on. The empire is over, but your dreams, they're just beginning.